Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. I never thought one wrong turn could change everything. It started like any other day for me. Just a simple drive back home after hanging out with some friends. I was 19, full of energy, a little reckless maybe, but never dangerous. The road was quiet, just the way I liked it, a long stretch of pavement cutting through the thick woods on both sides. It was late afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the road. The kind of light that makes everything look calm and peaceful, but somehow feels a little off. I was driving my old sedan, a hand-me-down from my dad. Nothing fancy, but it ran well enough. The road I took was supposed to lead me to the nearest town, a place where I could grab some gas and maybe get a bite to eat before heading home. I had driven this route once or twice before, but honestly, I hadn't paid much attention to the signs. I was just following my GPS, trying to trust the device to get me there without trouble. Then it happened. Somewhere along the way, I missed a sharp curve. I wasn't speeding, but maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. The tires slipped on some loose gravel at the edge of the road, and before I could react, the car swerved off the pavement and landed hard in a ditch filled with muddy water and dead leaves. The car bounced, the engine sputtered, and then it died. I was stuck. I sat there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to figure out what to do. My phone still had a little signal, so I grabbed it, dialed my parents, and started explaining the situation. I told them I was okay, but needed some help getting out. I told them where I was, or at least what I thought was my location, based on a GPS. The ditch was narrow, but deep enough to trap the car, the wheels spinning uselessly in the mud. While I was on the phone, I decided I should try to find help. I figured the nearest town couldn't be far, just a couple of miles tops. I told my parents I was going to walk there, and they urged me to stay put, but I wanted to be responsible, not waiting helplessly in a ditch for hours. I promised to keep the line open so they could hear me and know I was safe. The ditch was wet and cold, and the ground outside was soft and muddy from recent rain. I climbed out, the mud sticking to my boots. The forest around me was dense, tall pines and oaks, their branches creaking in the breeze. The road was silent except for the distant hum of a few cars far ahead. I started walking slowly, phone pressed to my ear, talking to my parents about what I saw, how the trees were thick, how the road curved ahead, how I could see faint lights that I thought must be from the town. It was getting darker now. The sun was almost gone, and the shadows in the woods felt heavier. I kept telling myself I was fine, that I just needed to get to help. But then, as I rounded a bend, I stepped on something soft and uneven and nearly lost my footing. I looked down, broken branches, thick underbrush, and something else. It was a strange patch of disturbed earth, like something had been dug up or moved recently. I wanted to tell my parents, but before I could say anything, I heard a noise, a snap from the trees behind me, something moving fast. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. My heart jumped. I tried to keep walking, but my breath was getting faster and my legs felt heavy. I kept my phone up to my ear, trying to talk, but the connection started to crackle. Then, without warning, I shouted, "Oh, shit," into the phone. My voice was sharp, panicked. Whatever I saw or felt had hit me like a wall, but before I could say more, the line went dead. No static, no ringing, just silence. I called back. Nothing. No answer. I called again and again, but the phone was dead. My screen showed no signal. I was alone, in the dark, somewhere I didn't understand, with no way to contact anyone. I tried retracing my steps, but the woods all looked the same. The path I thought was a road became a narrow trail, overgrown and twisting. My phone died completely in my pocket, leaving me in total silence. No flashlight, no map, just me and the night. I kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, some sign of civilization. But the forest closed in, the trees towering overhead, blocking out what little moonlight there was. The sounds of the woods at night became louder. The rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl. the cracking of twigs nearby. Every noise felt amplified, like something was watching, waiting. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat was dry. I realized I had no idea which way to go. I couldn't find the road again. The deeper I went, the less sure I was that I was heading toward the town. At one point, I thought I heard voices far off, but when I moved toward the sound, it vanished. The next day, a search party found my car stuck in the ditch exactly where I left it. No sign of me anywhere nearby. No footprints in the mud. No belongings left behind except the car keys on the driver's seat. The searchers combed the woods for days. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers, but no trace of me ever showed up. The police found no evidence of a struggle, no signs of foul play, nothing to explain what happened. It was as if I had vanished into thin air. Years later, people still talk about the strange case of a young man who disappeared after calling for help. Some say the forest swallowed me whole. Others believe I wandered so far I couldn't find my way back. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. The ditch was just the start. The road I thought led to town ended abruptly at a vast stretch of private land, owned by someone who rarely allowed visitors. That night, I unknowingly crossed into that land, and when I stepped off the road, I was trapped in a maze of thick woods with no paths, no way out. The noise I heard, the feeling of being followed, it was just the natural wildlife reacting to a stranger in their territory. No monsters, no ghosts, just me lost, scared, and fading into the wilderness. My calls for help ended because I was beyond the reach of any signal, and my steps disappeared in the soft earth without a trace. In the end, I became part of the forest, swallowed by nature's silence. The ditch was where I stopped being seen, but the woods were where I truly disappeared. There was no grand mystery, no supernatural force, just a young man lost to the wild, far from the roads and the people who cared. Sometimes, when the wind blows through those trees, you can almost hear a faint shout, a desperate call for help, carried away and never answered. I remember the first time I heard about the murders in that cabin high up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a story that trickled through the small town near the forest like a slow poison, creeping into the thoughts of everyone who lived there. The way the news came was never straightforward, just whispers, rumors, bits of facts mixed with confusion. But I learned enough to understand that something terrible had happened to a family up there, in a place no one wanted to be after dark. The cabin was old, sitting far away from any main road, tucked deep among thick pines and steep rocky hills. You had to drive down a narrow, winding dirt track to get there, one that was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I've been out in those woods myself many times, camping or hiking, so I knew how isolated that place felt. Cell phone signals were weak, and no one passed through unless they had a reason. It was the kind of place that felt completely cut off from the world. Like if something bad happened there, no one would hear a thing. The family that lived there was a mother, her 2 kids, a boy and a younger daughter, and a family friend who stayed with them sometimes. The mother was known in town, quiet but kind, and the children were shy but polite when they visited the local market or library. The family friend was a man who had come from out of town, someone who wanted to start fresh. No one knew much about him, but everyone assumed he was trustworthy because he seemed helpful around the cabin. One winter night, a brutal crime took place that shattered the quiet of that remote area. The mother, her son, and a family friend were all killed inside the cabin. The weapons used were knives and a hammer, tools that spoke of close, personal violence. The daughter, the youngest child, was missing. No one knew where she was, and the story turned darker as time passed. What made the case so strange and so frustrating was how the investigation unfolded. The 911 calls from that night were recorded, but somehow lost or ignored. Some people said the tapes were never properly reviewed. Others whispered about police mistakes or cover-ups. Evidence was misplaced. Leads went cold. Suspects were named quietly. People who had reasons to be angry or jealous, but no arrests were ever made. The case went from active investigation to cold file. Years later, the girls' remains were found far from the cabin. hidden under the thick brush and fallen leaves of the forest. The discovery confirmed the worst fears, that she had not escaped, and that the killer had done something even more terrible after the murders inside the cabin. The sense of justice never came. No one went to trial, no one was convicted, and the community was left with a deep, unshakable fear that the killer was still out there, free. I learned all this from news reports and from old-timers who told me stories over drinks at the local bar. But I wanted to understand more. I wanted to see the place where it all happened, to stand in the silence of that cabin and try to grasp what kind of evil had crept into the woods. When I finally got the chance, I took the old dirt road one late afternoon, driving slowly through the pine trees as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The air was cold and sharp. I could feel the weight of the place before I even saw the cabin, like the forest was holding its breath. The cabin itself was worn down by time and weather. The windows were dark and empty, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the smell was thick with damp wood and old smoke. The floor creaked beneath my boots. I found the kitchen table still standing, the chairs scattered as if someone had left in a rush. I imagined the mother cooking dinner, the children playing nearby, the family friends sitting by the fire. Then I thought of the knives and hammer, the instruments of death, and how they must have fallen to the floor in the chaos. There were no signs of ghosts or shadows, just the hollow silence of a place where life had been ripped away. The walls still held marks, old scratches and dents that told of desperate struggle. I saw where the door might have been forced open and the broken glass on the floor where a window had been shattered. I could almost hear the noise of the attack, the screams, the crashes, the heavy breathing. I thought about the missing girl, how she might have hidden or tried to run, and what terror she faced alone in the forest. The fact that her body was found years later meant she never made it out. The killer had followed through with cruelty beyond words. As I stood there, I thought about the police who came afterward, how they had handled the scene, how they might have missed key evidence or let bias cloud their judgment. I thought about the people who had motives, neighbors with grudges, strangers passing through, even family members with dark secrets. All of them suspects, but all of them walking free. The more I learned, the more I realized that this was a story about failure. Failure to protect, failure to solve, failure to bring peace to a broken family and a haunted town. The unanswered questions hung heavy in the air, like the thick pine sent outside the cabin. I left the cabin that evening with a feeling of deep sadness, but also clarity. This wasn't a story of mystery or ghost tales. It was a real tragedy, one that needed to be remembered, not forgotten or wrapped in myths. The only way to honor those lives lost was to keep searching for truth, to push for justice even when it seemed impossible. I don't know if the killer will ever be found, but I do know that no place, no family should ever be left in silence like that. The pain of what happened in that remote cabin remains real, and until someone steps forward or new evidence comes to light, the story stays unfinished, waiting for the day justice finally comes. The Cecil Hotel was always an odd place, even for downtown Los Angeles. It had a reputation, whispered and half forgotten, of being cheap, run down, and a place where people came and went like shadows. I never thought I'd end up working there, but a job was a job, and at the time, I needed one badly. I was a maintenance worker, mostly dealing with broken faucets, flickering lights, and creaky elevators. The kind of work nobody wanted, but someone had to do it. One of the complaints that started coming in early one summer was about the water. Guests were saying the water pressure was so low that they could barely get a shower. Others said the water tasted strange, metallic, almost like rust or chemicals. I didn't pay much attention at first. Old buildings like the Cecil often had plumbing issues, and water taste could be weird because of old pipes. But as the complaints grew, I knew it wasn't something we could just ignore. The hotel's plumbing system was ancient, a tangled mess of pipes and valves that ran through walls and ceilings like veins. There were water tanks on the roof, big steel cylinders that held the building's water supply. Maintenance rarely went up there because it wasn't easy to get to and the door was locked tight. But as the complaints piled up, the management finally decided to have us check the water tanks. The day we climbed up to the roof, I remember the heat was almost unbearable. The sun was beating down, and the rooftop felt like a concrete oven. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old tar from the roof surface. The door to the rooftop water tanks was rusty but still locked. We had to get the master key from the office. When we finally got the door open, the noise from the city below faded into a distant hum. Up there, it was quiet and strangely isolated. We approached the water tanks, giant, rounded containers that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. I could see dirt and grime caked on the sides, and there was a faint smell of mildew. One of the tanks had a hatch on top, sealed tight. We were told to open it carefully to inspect inside for any blockages or damage that might explain the water issues. The moment we lifted the heavy metal lid, a rush of cold, stale air escaped. Then, as the sunlight hit the inside, I saw something no one should ever see. There was a body inside the tank. It was Elisa Lamb. Elisa Lamb was a young woman, a guest at the Cecil. Her disappearance had been a mystery, and the police had been searching for her for weeks. What made it worse was the strange elevator footage that had been captured just days before she was found. The video showed Elisa inside the hotel elevator, acting erratically, pressing multiple buttons, hiding in corners, peeking out like she was scared of someone or something. The way she moved was frantic, disjointed, and completely bizarre. The whole thing went viral, people speculating about what was happening to her. But nothing prepared us for the reality. Elisa's body was in the water tank, sealed in the dark hole where no one could hear her or see her. How she got up there, how she managed to get into the tank itself, no one could explain. The rooftop door was locked from the outside, and security cameras did not show her entering or leaving the roof. The tank itself had no visible way to get in or out without a hatch, which was locked. For days after finding Elisa, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I kept thinking about how she must have been up there, trapped and alone, how the water pressure complaints were actually a sign something was terribly wrong. The water tasted bad because it had been contaminated, and the low pressure was caused by the blockage in the system created by her body. I tried to piece together what might have happened logically. I thought about the elevator footage and how she seemed scared. Maybe she was running from someone, or maybe she was scared of something inside the hotel. The Cecil had a dark history, and it was full of people with troubled lives, but none of that answered the main question. How did Elisa get into that tank? How could she climb up to the roof, open a locked door, and get inside a sealed water tank? It seemed impossible. I spent many hours exploring the rooftop, looking for any way she might have gotten there. There was a small ladder on the side of one tank, but it was too high and dangerous to climb without equipment. The roof had a few vents and pipes, but none were big enough to allow a person through. The rooftop door was locked, and the keys were always kept in the office. No staff reported seeing Elisa or anyone suspicious going onto the roof. The building itself was old, creaky, and complicated. Stairwells twisted in strange ways, and there were old maintenance shafts and service ladders scattered through the structure. But all those areas were locked and secured, except for the ones used by staff like me. If Elisa had managed to get into a service area, maybe she found a way to the roof. Still, the hardest part was the water tank hatch. It was bolted down tight. No one would open it without a tool. But someone had to get inside to fill or clean the tank occasionally, right? Could Elisa have known how to open it? Was she familiar with the hotel's inner workings? Or had she found a tool somewhere? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed she had to have been alone. The hotel was old and run down, and security was lax. If she was scared or unstable, she might have wandered the halls, found an unlocked door or a forgotten maintenance passage, and climbed to the roof. Maybe she thought hiding was the only way to get away from whatever was bothering her. But the tank was sealed, and once inside, there was no way out. Maybe she got trapped, or maybe she slipped and fell inside. The tank was tall, and if the hatch was closed behind her, there was no way to open it from the inside. The water inside the tank was cold and dark, and she probably didn't survive long. I couldn't imagine the fear she must have felt, trapped in the dark, surrounded by cold water, alone and helpless. The image of her frantic movements in the elevator made sense now. Maybe she was trying to get help, or maybe she was scared out of her mind and looking for a place to hide. The hotel was a maze, and it swallowed her whole. After the discovery, the hotel shut down the water tanks and started a full inspection of the plumbing and rooftop security. They added locks, alarms, and cameras in places that had never had them before. Staff and guests were shaken by what happened. Some moved out. The hotel's reputation took a further hit. For me, working at the Cecil after that was different. I saw the hotel not just as a building, but as a place full of stories like Elise's, stories of people lost, scared, and forgotten. The water pressure problem was more than a plumbing issue. It was a silent cry for help no one heard until it was too late. Elise's death was a terrible accident, but also showed how dangerous neglect and poor building security could be. A locked door, an old water tank, and a frightened young woman trapped where no one could find her. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real problems hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. Her story haunted me for years, not because of anything supernatural, but because it was so real and so tragic. The Cecil Hotel kept standing, its walls full of secrets, but I never forgot the day we lifted that water tank lid and found Elisa inside, a chilling reminder of how fragile life can be in the shadows of a broken building. I worked at a lodge near Yosemite National Park, a place where tourists came to find peace, adventure, or just a break from their busy lives. It was supposed to be a quiet job, fixing broken doors, patching up leaks, making sure everything ran smoothly. I was the handyman, the guy everyone trusted to keep the place in order. Nobody thought twice about me, and maybe that's what made everything worse. When I first started, I was just another face in the crowd. I wore my work boots and tool belt every day, moving through the lodge halls and cabins, fixing what needed fixing. I smiled at the guests and chatted with the staff, just small talk. I was careful to blend in, to be the kind of person no one would suspect. The lodge was busy in the summer months, full of families and hikers. The woods nearby were thick and deep, a perfect place for people to disappear if they wanted. Or so I thought. The first woman I killed was someone I barely knew. She was a guest at the lodge, a woman who came alone, probably looking for some quiet time in nature. I remember the day clearly. She was sitting on the porch of one of the cabins, reading a book. I went over under the pretense of checking something inside her cabin. She looked up and smiled politely, and I said a few words about the weather, about the lodge. She didn't seem worried or scared. That's what I wanted, to seem normal. Later, when no one was around, I took her somewhere no one would find her easily. The woods behind the lodge were dense, full of thick trees and underbrush. I knew the trails well, the places where no one went. I remember how quiet it was, the way the wind moved through the leaves. I felt calm. I didn't feel anything like guilt or fear. I had been thinking about this for years, but now it was real. The second woman was a local. She worked nearby, a waitress at the diner that many guests went to after a day of hiking. She was friendly, always saying hello when I stopped in for a coffee or a quick meal. We talked about small things, her kids, the weather, the usual. No one would ever guess what happened next. I saw her one evening when she was closing up alone. I followed her for a while, waiting for the right moment. When it came, I took her quickly and quietly. It wasn't easy at first, hiding what I'd done, but I was careful. I cleaned up after myself, and I never left evidence. The forest swallowed their bodies, the dirt and leaves hiding what I couldn't erase. Each time, I watched the news hoping they wouldn't find the missing women. I felt a strange thrill in knowing how close I was to getting away with it. The third and fourth women came later, each time the same method. I kept up appearances, fixing things around the lodge, talking to people who had no idea what I was hiding. Sometimes I wondered how I could act so normal, smile at strangers, while knowing what I had done. But the truth was, I felt nothing. I had been thinking about killing since I was a child. It was a dark part of me I never shared, not even with myself. Then the day came when the FBI showed up. They had questions about the missing women, and I was there every day at the lodge. They talked to me casually, asking about my work, my routine, my days. I answered like I always did, normal, calm, collected. I don't know why I didn't run or hide. Maybe I was tired of pretending. Maybe I just wanted it to be over. One afternoon, I walked into the office where the agents were waiting. I told them everything. I confessed without hesitation, without fear. The look on their faces didn't surprise me. They were calm, professional, but I could see the shock behind their eyes. I gave them the details, where I had taken the women, how I had done it. They took me away quietly. No shouting, no struggle. In the end, I didn't want to be a secret anymore. I wanted the truth to be out, even if it meant losing everything. The lodge closed down after the news broke. People said they couldn't believe someone like me could live among them without anyone seeing it. The woods stayed quiet, but now they held stories no one wanted to hear. Looking back, I know what I did was wrong, but I can't change it. I lived with this darkness inside me for so long, hiding it behind a mask of normalcy. That's the scariest part, not ghosts or monsters, but the fact that a person can look so ordinary and still hide something terrible. Sometimes the worst evil is the one no one expects. I was driving down the M6 motorway late one night, my headlights cutting through the thick mist rolling in from the fields on either side of the road. The night was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional distant rumble of other cars. The road stretched out ahead, straight and empty. I was tired, maybe a little too tired, but I kept going, hoping to reach the next rest stop soon. Suddenly, out of nowhere, two figures appeared in the middle of the motorway. At first, I thought they were just people trying to cross, but then I saw it was two young women running side by side, almost as if they were moving together in some strange, synchronized way. They didn't seem to notice the cars speeding toward them. My heart jumped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I swerved, but I was too close. The impact shook the car violently. For a split second, everything was chaos. The women collapsed onto the asphalt, and I could see the terror in the eyes of other drivers as they swerved and braked hard. Some cars couldn't stop in time. The screams and honks echoed. Then, just as fast as it started, everything went quiet again, except for the emergency sirens now wailing in the distance. I didn't get out of the car right away. I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. The two women were still lying on the road. One was moving slightly, the other completely still. I heard someone shout for help, and a few people ran toward them. I couldn't look away. The police arrived quickly, followed by ambulances. They closed off the motorway, and soon the whole scene was crawling with emergency workers. They pulled the women off the road carefully, trying to avoid causing more harm. It was clear they were alive, but badly hurt. One was barely conscious. I later found out that the women were twin sisters from Sweden, visiting England for the first time. What stunned everyone was not just that they had run into the motorway traffic, as if they wanted to die, but that they both survived multiple hits from speeding cars. The doctors called it a miracle, but that was just the beginning of a very strange and frightening story. The twins were rushed to the hospital, and the police and mental health teams got involved. The women were placed under psychiatric care, but something was off. They seemed disconnected from reality. Their eyes empty, their behavior erratic. They refused to speak or explain what had happened. It was clear something severe was going on in their minds. After a few days, one of the sisters was released. The doctors thought she was stable enough, but they were wrong. That very same night, the sister left the hospital and went to a stranger's house. Without any warning, she stabbed the man inside, killing him. The attack was brutal and sudden. The man had no idea what hit him. Police found her nearby, calm and almost distant, as if she didn't understand what she had done. They arrested her immediately. The news spread quickly, and people were shocked. How could someone survive a hit on a motorway, then commit such a violent act so soon after being released from care? Mental health experts were baffled. They said the twins seemed to have experienced a shared psychotic episode, a rare condition where two people share the same delusions and lose touch with reality together. It was almost like their minds had been connected, twisting and breaking in the same way. The sisters didn't seem aware of what was happening to them. Their behavior was so strange and unpredictable that even the police didn't know how to handle the case. I remember thinking about the man who was killed. He was just an ordinary person, living his life quietly with no enemies. How did the sister end up there? What made her do it? The whole situation was so cruel and confusing. The police investigation went deep, trying to piece together the twins' movements, their mental state, and what might have triggered such a breakdown. They spoke with friends and family back in Sweden and learned that the sisters had a history of mental health problems, but nothing like this had ever happened before. In the weeks that followed, the surviving sister was kept in psychiatric custody, closely monitored and treated. The doctors worked hard to understand her condition and help her recover. The other twin, who was seriously injured on the motorway, stayed in a hospital for much longer, slowly healing from her wounds. The case became a harsh reminder of how fragile the human mind can be and how mental illness can lead to shocking acts that make no sense to those watching from the outside. The twin story stayed with me for a long time. It made me realize how quickly life can spiral out of control, how something hidden inside a person can suddenly explode with terrifying consequences. In the end, justice was complicated. The sister who killed the man was not treated like a common criminal. The courts recognized her mental illness and ordered her to remain in psychiatric care indefinitely until she could be safely reintegrated into society, if that was ever possible. The victim's family struggled to find closure, caught between grief and the confusing truth that this terrible act was born out of a mind broken beyond repair. The other twin eventually recovered enough to return home to Sweden, but she was forever changed. She rarely spoke of that night, and the bond between the sisters, once so close, was fractured beyond repair. I think about the motorway often now, the empty road, the sudden chaos, the girls running as if they wanted to vanish into nothingness. There was no magic, no ghost story, just two young lives shattered by something dark and unseen in their minds, leaving a trail of pain and confusion behind them. It was real, too real, and the echo of that night still haunts me every time I drive past a quiet stretch of road, wondering if someone else might suddenly run out into the headlights, lost in their own private madness. It started sometime in early March, when winter still held its grip tight on the land. Snow clung to the ground like mold to rot, deep enough to swallow a boot if you didn't step just right. I lived with my wife and our 4 kids on an old farm tucked far off the main road. We were a couple hours from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but trees, fences, and cold sky. No neighbors, no quick help. That was how we liked it. The farmhouse was plain. 2 stories, peeling white paint, a metal roof that howled on windy nights. The barn was behind it, weathered and sagging, still good enough to hold our tools, feed, and the animals we kept. Chickens, a few goats, 2 cows, and an old shepherd dog named Buddy. He was getting too old to do much anymore, but he still barked when strangers came near. That dog knew everyone who belonged on the land. He didn't bark much anymore. It was my wife, Julie, who first noticed something strange. She came in from the yard one morning with a weird look on her face and said there were boot prints in the snow leading from the tree line to the side of the house. Just one set, no prints leading away. I figured it was nothing. Maybe I'd made them and just forgot. But she was sure. She checked the size, said they were bigger than mine. And there was something else that made her skin crawl. They led up to the side window, the one facing our daughter's bedroom. I brushed it off. Out here, you don't panic over every weird thing. Animals wander. Sometimes drifters cut through to make their way faster. I figured someone passed by, maybe had a look in, then moved on. Still, I checked all the locks that night. Double-checked the doors and windows. Everything was shut tight. 2 days later, it snowed again. Thick, heavy flakes that muffled sound and coated everything. We were stuck inside for most of the day. Around midnight, when the wind started to pick up, I heard something in the attic. Not just the house creaking or mice scratching, but movement, real weight on wood. I stood under the hatch, staring up, waiting to hear it again. It came in slow thuds, not rushed or panicked. It sounded like someone pacing. I didn't go up there that night. I didn't tell Julie either. I told myself it was a squirrel or maybe a raccoon that had found its way in through some crack in the eaves. We had that happen once before. The next morning, I went up with a flashlight. The attic was empty, dusty, cold, full of old boxes and crates we never touched. But one thing was off. A pile of insulation in the corner was disturbed, mashed down like someone had been laying on it. Nearby, I saw something that didn't make sense, a used food wrapper. Not one we had. Some off-brand beef jerky in a crinkled red wrapper. We didn't buy that kind. I still didn't tell anyone. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to scare them. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared too. That same day, we noticed the first set of keys missing. The spare set to the shed was gone. We always kept it on a hook in the kitchen, high up where the kids couldn't reach. I asked Julie, then each of the kids, if they moved it. Nobody had. I looked everywhere, even outside. I found nothing. Then I checked the shed. It was locked, but something was wrong. A small gap in the door, like it had been opened and closed again, not quite right. Inside, everything looked in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been in there. After that, it felt like the house started breathing different. It felt like we were being watched all the time. At night, I'd get up to check the doors again and again, sometimes 3 for times before I could sleep. Buddy stopped sleeping on the porch. He'd come inside and stay curled up by the fire, ears perked, eyes on the front door. When he barked now, it was low and angry. One morning, just before sunrise, I saw another set of prints. This time, they came from behind the barn and led straight to the back porch. I followed them in the snow, my shotgun in hand. They ended right at the steps. I looked around. The sky was just starting to lighten. It was quiet. No birds yet, just that deep cold that squeezes the breath from your lungs. I stood there staring down, and for the first time in years, I felt a kind of fear I couldn't explain. Not fear for myself, but for my family. I felt like something was closing in on us. Something patient. Something that had time. I made my way back inside and told Julie. She got real quiet. She didn't say anything, just looked out the window with her hand on the glass. We started locking the bedroom doors at night, even inside the house. That's how bad it got. I slept with the shotgun across my lap. Every creak, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. Still, nothing happened. No broken windows, no busted locks. Just the signs. Always the signs. It was the third night after I saw those prints that everything came apart. I remember the sound that woke me. A high, dry whimper. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and listened. Then I heard again. It was Buddy. He was outside. I got up still groggy and opened the front door. Buddy was lying in the snow just off the porch. I thought he was sleeping at first. Then I saw the blood. His throat was cut clean. No mess, no struggle. Just a single line across his neck. My stomach dropped. That dog had been with me for over a decade. He didn't go down easy. Whoever did it, they did it quiet. That's when I knew it wasn't some scared drifter or thief. This was someone with a plan. I ran back inside and locked the door. Woke Julie, told her to grab the kids. We gathered in the hallway. All 5 of us crowded around. I told them to stay together, to stay in the room, no matter what. I want to get the shotgun. It was gone. I don't remember dropping it. I don't remember moving it. But it wasn't where I left it. It wasn't anywhere. My chest tightened. I started to sweat. Then the lights went out. Just like that, total blackness. The heater shut off. The house fell silent, like someone had pushed a mute button on the world. I had an old flashlight in the drawer. I grabbed it and flicked it on. The beam was weak, barely enough to cut through the dark. I swept it across the room, down the hall, up the stairs. That's when I heard the attic door creak open. I turned toward the sound and froze. I could hear the hinges groaning, soft and slow. Then came the footsteps, heavy and steady, coming down the ladder. I backed into the kids' room and locked the door. Julie held the little ones close. I looked around the room for anything I could use as a weapon. A chair, a lamp, nothing that would stop someone for long. The footsteps reached the hallway. Slow, careful. I killed the flashlight. The room went black again, except for the faint blue of the moonlight through the curtains. We waited. I held my breath, ears straining. I heard the floorboards creak outside the door. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then the knob turned. I rushed to hold it still. It didn't shake or twist hard. Just a single testing turn. Then nothing. Whoever it was, they didn't try to break in. They didn't kick or bang. They just turned the knob once and walked away. Eventually, the police came. I don't know who called them. It wasn't me. I don't remember much after that. What I do remember is the blood. They found all of us in the house, spread out, each in different rooms, each hit in the head with a mattock, over and over. No gunshots, no screams reported by anyone. Just gone, wiped out. But I was found alive. The blow to my head had been shallow. Maybe he thought I was dead. Maybe he rushed it. But I survived. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, my skull cracked, but healing. The rest of my family wasn't so lucky. The part that keeps me up now, the part that haunts me more than the murders, is what they found after. The police said someone had stayed in the house, slept in the beds, ate our food. They found dishes in the sink, crumbs on the table. The animals were fed. Eggs were collected. Whoever killed us didn't run. They stayed. There are no fingerprints. No signs of forced entry. The prints in the snow had melted. The keys were still gone. The police never caught anyone. Never even got a name. The story hit the news for a while, and then faded like all the others. People moved on, but I didn't. Now I live alone in a trailer on the edge of another nowhere. I keep every door locked. I sleep with a light on. I haven't been in an attic since. Sometimes I hear things. Footsteps, doors creaking. I never check. The mattock they used, it was mine. It hung in the shed, right where I left it. Right where it stayed until the day someone came out of the woods and made sure I'd never forget. I never imagined a simple dream, buying a house to call our own, could turn into the darkest nightmare we've ever faced. But that's exactly what happened. My wife and I had spent years hunting for the perfect home. We wanted a place where our 2 kids could grow up safe, where we could make memories without worrying about the world outside. After months of searching, we found it. A large old house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't flashy, but it had charm. Solid wood floors, wide windows, and a deep backyard where the kids could play. The kind of house you imagine your family living in for decades. The sellers were an older couple who had lived there for over 50 years. They had raised their children in that house, and they swore it held nothing but good memories. The neighborhood was friendly, neighbors waved when we walked by, and everything felt just right. We signed the papers, packed up, and prepared to move in. That's when the letters started. The first one came a few days before our scheduled move-in date. It was slipped under the front door, no signature, no return address. At first, I thought it was a prank. The handwriting was neat, but cold. It said simply, "I am the Watcher. I have watched this house for generations." I showed it to my wife. She laughed it off as a joke, maybe some kid in the neighborhood messing around. But the next letter arrived 3 days later. This one was longer, more detailed, and suddenly, it felt terrifying. "I've seen you and your family come and go. I know your children's names, Emma and Jack. Have they found what's in the walls yet?" That line froze me. How did anyone know our kids' names? We hadn't told anyone outside of close family. And what could possibly be in the walls? We called the police. They took the letters, promised to investigate, but admitted they had little to go on. No fingerprints, no DNA, no clues about who might be sending them. We hired a security company. Cameras were installed around the property, motion sensors, alarms. Every night, I stayed up watching the feeds, waiting for something, anything, to explain this nightmare. But nothing appeared on the cameras. No one ever showed up. The letters kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. "Your children are special. Have you looked carefully enough? The house keeps its secrets. It always has." They mentioned things only someone who had been inside the house for a long time would know. The creak of the floorboards, the old light switch in the basement that no longer worked, the loose brick near the fireplace. We never found a sign of forced entry. No footprints in the yard. No signs anyone had been inside. It was as if this watcher was invisible, always watching but never seeing. At first, I thought the letters might be the work of a lonely neighbor or someone with a grudge against the sellers. But when I tried talking to the neighbors, none of them mentioned ever seeing anyone strange or suspicious around the house. Our children started getting scared. Emma refused to sleep in her room, saying she heard whispers at night. Jack stopped playing outside altogether. We tried to shield them, but the fear seeped into the walls of the house like a cold draft. The scariest part was the mention of what's in the walls. I couldn't get out of my head. My curiosity got the better of me one afternoon while the kids were at school. I grabbed a hammer and started peeling away old wallpaper in the basement. Underneath was peeling paint, and behind a loose panel, I found a small, hidden space, a narrow cavity inside the wall. It wasn't big enough for anything or anyone to hide in, but it was old and dusty, as if it had been untouched for decades. There was no treasure, no secret documents, just dirt and some old bits of paper, too faded to read. Still, the sense that the house was hiding something gnawed at me. The letters kept coming, and they became more personal. One day, there was a letter that read, "Have you taught Emmett to keep her secrets? Jack seems to listen too much." I stopped opening the letters. My wife wanted to ignore them altogether. We both hoped that if we pretended they didn't exist, maybe the person would give up. But the letters came more frequently after that, sometimes twice a week. We started finding small things moved inside the house. A toy left in the middle of the hallway, a family photo turned face down, doors unlocked when we were sure we had locked them. Nothing major, but enough to make our nerves snap. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. My heart was pounding so loud, I thought the whole house would hear it. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, creeping out of bed. The house was dark and silent. I checked every room. No one was there. I found a fresh letter slipped under the front door. It said I was inside. I always am. I called the police again, but by then, they were telling me this was likely a stalker, someone obsessed with the house and the family moving in. They advised us to leave, but how could we abandon our dream? We tried changing our locks, installing cameras inside the house, hiring a guard for the nights. Still, the letters came. Still, the small signs of someone's presence lingered. Our children stopped sleeping through the night. Emma started having nightmares about the house itself. Jack became withdrawn and anxious. We were losing our family to the fear. After 2 months of living like prisoners in our own home, my wife and I made the hardest decision of our lives. We would never move in. We broke the lease, sold everything we had planned for the new house, and left town without looking back. The letters stopped. We moved into a small rental apartment far away, where no one watched, where no one sent us chilling notes about secrets buried in the walls. Sometimes late at night, I wonder who the watcher really was. What made them fixate on our family, why they knew our kids' names. The police never found any evidence. The neighbors had no answers. But I know one thing for certain. Some houses are better left empty. Some secrets are better left buried. And some watchers never stop watching. It started with something small. A carton of milk I was sure I hadn't finished was empty one morning. I live alone in a one-room apartment in Fukuoka. It's a quiet neighborhood, and I'm a quiet man. I work long hours at a shipping company and mostly keep to myself. No friends over, no parties, nothing strange. Just work, sleep, repeat. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired. Maybe I really had used more of the milk than I remembered. Maybe I was losing track of things. I told myself I'd be more careful. I'd pay closer attention. But the next week, my loaf of bread was almost gone, and I knew I hadn't eaten that much. It was white bread in a plastic bag with a red label. I had counted 6 slices left the night before. The next morning, there were only 2. I stood in the kitchen staring at it, trying to figure out what could have happened. No one had a key. I hadn't given anyone access to my apartment. There were no signs of a break-in. The lock was untouched, the window closed and latched. It started happening more often. My eggs would vanish, toilet paper rolls would disappear, or be used faster than they should have. A bottle of shampoo emptied in a week when it normally lasted me a month. Nothing major, just strange small things. Sometimes I'd come home and feel like the air was different, like someone had been there. But there were no signs, no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing moved in any obvious way. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something in my gut told me something wasn't right. I checked the locks every night. I even started taping a hair across the door frame. I read about that trick somewhere. If someone opens the door, the hair falls. But every time I came home, it was still there. Then one night, I found a rice ball missing. It was one I had made that morning and placed at the back of the fridge. I checked twice before I left for work. It was there. When I got back home, it was gone. That was it for me. I wasn't imagining things. Something was happening, and I needed to know what. I bought a small motion-sensitive camera from an electronics store near Tension. I didn't have much money, but I figured it was worth it. I placed it on a shelf above the microwave, angled to cover the kitchen and most of the living space. It was one of those little white dome cameras that link to your phone. It started recording only when it detected movement. That first night, I could barely sleep. I kept looking at the app on my phone. Nothing happened. No alerts. No movement. The next day, I checked the footage. Just me making dinner, brushing my teeth, going to bed. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then on the third day, I got a notification while I was at work. Motion detected. I opened the app, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It was a woman, middle-aged, thin, dressed in a stretched-out white t-shirt and old gray sweatpants. She climbed down from the top of my closet. There was a cabinet space above it, a built-in crawl space I never used because it was too high up. I thought of it as useless storage. She slowly dropped down, barefoot, and moved quietly into the kitchen. She opened the fridge, took out a rice ball, and sat on the floor to eat it. She drank straight from my milk carton. She didn't rush. She moved like she had done this many times before. Then she cleaned up, wiped her fingerprint from the counter with a rag, and climbed back up. She pulled the door of the cabinet shut behind her. I sat there at my desk at work, staring at my phone, not sure what to do. I replayed the footage again and again. There was no mistake. She was real. This wasn't a ghost or a dream. A real person had been living in my home. I felt sick, violated. I thought about all the times I walked around in my underwear, left the bathroom door open, slept with the window cracked for air. She had been there the whole time. I left work early and went straight to the police. They didn't believe me at first. I had to show them the footage twice. Then they sent 2 officers with me to my apartment. I stood in the hallway while they searched. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I kept thinking about her up there, crouched in the dark, listening to us. One officer pulled over a small chair and stood on it to reach the cabinet above the closet. He opened it slowly, flashlight in hand. Then he called for his partner. She was in there, curled up in the back of the space, covered in a thin blanket. There was a plastic water bottle, a bag with clothes, some wrappers, and a small notepad. She didn't speak. She just looked at them, blinking in the flashlight's glare. They helped her down and handcuffed her. She didn't fight. The officers took her outside, and I followed. She looked tired, dirty. Her hair was thin and matted. She didn't say a word. Not to me, not to them. Later, the police told me she was homeless. She had been living like that for almost a year. She had found an unlocked back door in our apartment complex that led to the rooftop stairs. From there, she entered through a hallway window. I never checked because I thought it was too small for anyone to fit through. Apparently, it wasn't. She'd crawl in, wait until I left, and move around just enough to eat, clean herself up, and then disappear again. They said she had no record, no history of violence. She was just a woman who had lost everything and was trying to survive. She had been sneaking into buildings for years, but she'd never stayed in one place this long. My apartment was small, quiet, and I worked long hours. I was perfect. They found fingerprints everywhere, places I hadn't thought to check. The back of the bookshelf, inside my laundry basket, the top of the bathroom door frame. She had studied my routine, figured out my habits, and stayed completely out of sight. She never left a mess. She always put things back. I had only noticed because she got comfortable enough to start taking more food. They didn't charge her with much. Technically, it was trespassing and theft, but she hadn't damaged anything. There was talk of getting her help, shelter, food programs, counseling. I didn't follow up. I didn't want to know what happened to her. Part of me felt sorry for her. The other part couldn't sleep for weeks. Even after she was gone, I kept imagining her up there. I installed new locks, double-checked the windows, even paid for a contractor to seal up the crawl space completely. I threw out most of the furniture and bought new things. I changed my routine, left lights on at night, started taking time off work just to sit in my apartment and listen. I never heard anything. She was really gone. But the feeling stayed, that someone had watched me without my knowing, had studied me, lived in the same space, breathed the same air. She had been there when I showered, when I cooked, when I sang to myself without realizing it. That kind of intrusion doesn't go away easily. It sits in your skin, in your walls. I moved out after 6 months. I broke my lease and paid the penalty. I didn't care. I found a new place, smaller but on the second floor, with no crawl spaces, no high cabinets, nothing hidden. I still check every closet and under every bed before I sleep. I don't trust silence anymore. I never saw her again. No updates, no follow-ups. The news didn't cover it. It was just one strange incident in a quiet city. Sometimes I wonder how she got so good at hiding. How many other places she lived in. How many other people never even found out. That's what gets me the most. Not that it happened, but that it probably happens more often than we think. That someone could live beside us, above us, under us, and we'd never know. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't trying to hurt me, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. Now, every time I hear a creak in the night or find something out of place, I freeze. I stare at the spot, wondering, because once it happens to you, you stop thinking it's impossible. You stop telling yourself, that would never happen to me, because it did, and it changed everything. I was driving late at night, alone, on a stretch of highway I didn't know well. The road cut through miles of empty forest, the kind of place where the only light comes from the stars and your car's headlights. It was the kind of night where everything feels quiet, almost too quiet, like the world is holding its breath. The radio played softly, but mostly I kept the volume low, not wanting to distract myself in the long drive ahead. I had started just after dusk, leaving the city behind. The sky was a dark navy now, with thick clouds hiding the moon. The road was narrow and winding, and trees crowded close to the edges, their branches sometimes scraping the roof of my car as I passed. The air smelled damp, like rain had just fallen, though I hadn't seen any drops. The temperature had dropped quickly since sunset, and I could see my breath in the cold air when I rolled down the window for a moment to clear my head. I was heading to a remote cabin a friend had lent me, deep in the woods. The plan was simple: spend a few days alone, right, clear my mind, maybe get some rest. The last few months had been hard. Work was stressful, and I needed to get away. The cabin was supposed to be peaceful, far from anything that could bother me. But as I drove, the feeling of being alone started to press down on me. I've driven alone many times before, camped in the woods, and been far from people. But something about this night was different. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, or the way my headlights picked up strange shapes at the edge of the road that disappeared when I blinked. The kind of feeling that makes you double-check your doors and glance nervously in the rearview mirror. I reached a small sign that said Forest Road 12 and turned off the main highway onto a gravel path. The road narrowed even more, and the trees seemed to crowd in tighter. I drove slower, watching the road carefully. Patches of mud and puddles from recent rain made the drive tricky. Every now and then, I caught a flicker of movement in the woods, a rabbit, maybe, or a deer, but my mind kept playing tricks on me, making me think it was something else. After about 10 minutes, I saw the cabin's dirt driveway. I pulled in and stopped the car. The cabin was a small wooden building with a single porch light that flickered weakly. The windows were dark, the kind of glass that showed no reflection but revealed nothing inside. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the door. It opened with a creak, and the smell of old wood and pine filled the air. Inside, it was cold and quiet. The place was simple, just a few pieces of furniture, a small kitchen, and a wood stove that hadn't been lit in a while. I set my bags down and closed the door behind me, locking it carefully. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard an animal call. I started a fire in the stove, watching the flames catch and slowly warm the room. The cabin felt safe in the glow of the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, the woods were full of animals, and I was in a new place. I spent the evening reading and writing, the quiet broken only by the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. When I finally went to bed, I double-checked the locks and slid the bolt across the door. The bed was stiff but comfortable, and I pulled the blanket up to my chin. Somewhere around midnight, I woke to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, a soft, crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. I froze, listening. The cabin was surrounded by forest, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. No one was supposed to be out here. I didn't want to look outside. I kept my eyes shut, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. The steps came closer, slow and steady. Then, they stopped right outside the porch. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, heavy and uneven. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of the wind or the trees, but my gut said otherwise. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever or whatever was out there could hear it. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for whatever it was to move on. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps turned and walked away, fading slowly into the darkness. I didn't dare open the door or look out the window until the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, the forest looked peaceful again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the gravel driveway and the surrounding woods. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone else. Just my tire tracks and the usual marks animals left in the mud. I tried to relax and tell myself I had imagined the whole thing, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I spent the day exploring the nearby trails, keeping my phone close and my senses sharp. The forest was beautiful but heavy, like it held secrets just beyond the trees. That night, I locked the doors again and sat by the fire, too tense to sleep. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, this time slower, more deliberate. They circled the cabin, crunching on the gravel, stopping and starting, as if whoever was out there was thinking about what to do next. I stayed silent and still, waiting for morning again. When dawn came, I decided I wasn't going to stay in that cabin any longer. I packed my things quickly, grabbed my keys, and started the car. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of a dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line. I drove fast, but carefully, not daring to look back until I reached the main highway. When I finally pulled into a gas station and stepped inside, the normal noises and lights of people felt like a shield. I was safe. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told anyone exactly what I heard or saw. But the memories stayed with me. The sound of footsteps in the night, the feeling of eyes watching from the dark, and the cold that wasn't just from the weather. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I still hear those steps echoing just beyond the trees. It was late October when I decided to take a weekend off and get away from the city. I had found an old cabin for rent, about 2 hours out in the woods, far from any towns or busy roads. The pictures online made it look perfect, rustic but sturdy, with a wood stove, a small porch, and a creek running nearby. I wanted to escape, just be alone with nature, no phone, no internet, no distractions. Something about the quiet of the woods always calmed me down. I left Friday afternoon, packed a bag with some clothes, food, and a few books. The drive was mostly empty roads winding through dense trees that were already losing their leaves. The colors were deep reds, oranges, and browns, the air crisp and fresh as I rolled the windows down. I wanted to feel every bit of the change in season, the smell of fallen leaves, the chill that hinted at winter coming soon. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. The place was smaller than I thought, but sturdy, made of rough logs and stone, like it had been built decades ago and maintained since then. There was a stack of firewood beside the porch, some old rocking chairs with peeling paint, and a rusty mailbox at the end of the dirt driveway. No signs of neighbors or other cabins nearby, just the quiet forest. The first thing I did was unload my things and bring them inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and smoke from the fireplace, maybe from the last renters or the caretaker. I opened all the windows to let the fresh air in. The inside was simple: a small kitchen with a sink but no running water, a tiny bathroom with an outhouse outside, and one main room with a table, a couch, and the wood stove. Upstairs was a loft with a bed and some blankets. I checked the wood stove and found some kindling and logs left over from last time. I started a fire to warm the place, and a soft crackling of the flames filled the room. I had brought canned food and some bread, so I heated up a simple meal on a small camping stove I had packed just in case. As the fire grew, the room filled with a warm orange glow. Outside, the last bit of sunlight disappeared and the forest went dark. I sat by the fire with a book, but the words didn't hold my attention. Instead, I listened to the sounds outside: the wind through the trees, the distant call of a bird settling for the night, the faint rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, but also strange, like the silence was so complete it became loud in its own way. When I decided to turn in, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to use the outhouse. The night air was cold and smelled like earth and pine. I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. The sky was clear and stars were bright, sparkling between the branches above. I felt a strange calm standing there, just me and the forest. Back inside, I closed the windows and settled into bed. The wood stove kept the loft warm enough, but I still pulled the blankets tight around me. I listened to the sounds of the cabin settling, creaks from the wood, the occasional pop from the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the trees and making shadows dance on the walls. Sleep came slowly. Every little noise made me open my eyes: a branch tapping the window, the distant crack of something falling. But I reminded myself I was alone, safe, and there was nothing to fear. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sharp noise like something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I sat up in bed listening hard. Outside, the wind was still blowing, but everything seemed quiet again. I told myself it was probably a branch knocked loose by the wind, or maybe an animal brushing against the cabin. The next morning, I found some broken twigs and flattened grass near the porch, but nothing else. No footprints or signs of any person or large animal. Still, I stayed alert the rest of the day, keeping the fire going and checking around the cabin every hour or so. That afternoon, I took a walk down to the creek. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones with a steady murmur. The trees around the creek were taller, their roots tangled and dipping into the water. I sat on a rock for a while, skipping stones and watching leaves float downstream. It was the kind of peaceful moment I'd been hoping for. But as the sun dropped lower, I noticed something strange. I saw a faint trail, like a path through the underbrush, leading away from the creek and deeper into the forest. It wasn't marked on any map, and I hadn't seen it before. Curiosity pulled me toward it, but after a few steps, I stopped. The trail was narrow and barely used, the ground soft and damp. I turned back to the cabin, feeling uneasy without knowing exactly why. That night was colder. I built a bigger fire and sat close, watching the flames. The wind had died down, but the quiet seemed heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, the noise came again, this time slow and deliberate, like footsteps crunching on leaves just outside the window. I froze, staring into the dark. The flashlight was on the table beside me, but I didn't want to move. The footsteps stopped, then shifted to the other side of the cabin, circling around slowly. It wasn't a large animal. The steps were too heavy and slow for a deer or a fox. It sounded like a person. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks in the dark. But the sound of breathing, faint and uneven, came through the thin walls. I knew I wasn't alone. The cabin door was locked, the windows shut tight. I stayed by the fire, clutching a heavy stick I found outside earlier. The footsteps continued around the cabin, slow and careful, as if whoever it was trying not to make noise but still wanted to be close. After what felt like hours, the footsteps finally stopped. The breathing faded. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, staring at the door, waiting. When morning came, I went outside carefully. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and now I could see clear footprints circling the cabin. heavy boots, the kind hunters or workers might wear. They were fresh, maybe only hours old. I walked this circle slowly, trying to figure out who had been there. No other signs, no dropped items, no voices. Just the footprints and the broken twigs on the porch. The day was tense. I kept checking the perimeter, peeking through the windows, and keeping the fire going. I thought about leaving right away, but the nearest town was 2 hours back, and the road was rough. I needed to wait until nightfall to get out safely. That afternoon, as the sun was low, I heard the noise again, a low grunt from the woods behind the cabin. It was an animal. It was close, maybe just a few hundred feet away. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the porch, shining it into the trees. Nothing, just shadows. I decided to stay inside until dark. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair, stacked some firewood in front of the windows, and sat by the stove. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. The night was long and cold. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin more times than I could count. The breathing, the shuffling, sometimes a faint scraping, like something being dragged through the leaves. At one point, the fire nearly died, and I scrambled to get more wood. I could hear the footsteps right outside the door as I reached for the logs. My heart was pounding. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing hard. The hours crawled by. At dawn, the footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my things quickly, loaded my bag in the fading light, and stepped outside. The air was cold, but fresh. I took one last look around, the broken branches, the footprints, the silent trees, and started walking back toward the dirt road. It was the longest 2-hour walk I've ever taken, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following. But the forest stayed quiet, the only sound my footsteps on the dry leaves. When I finally reached my car, relief hit me hard. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away, not once looking back. I've never gone back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there that night, circling, watching. But I know I wasn't alone, and whatever it wasn't going away. Now, every time I think about that weekend, I remember how close I was to danger, just from being alone in the woods. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was something real, someone out there in the dark, waiting and watching, with no reason to say hello or leave me alone. That cabin will stay empty for me. Some places don't want visitors, and some secrets are better left undiscovered. I had planned this weekend for weeks. Just me, a remote cabin, and the woods. I needed a break from everything, from the noise and stress of city life, from people constantly being around. The cabin was miles away from any town, deep in the forest where the only sound should have been birds, wind through the trees, and maybe a creek somewhere nearby. The kind of place where you feel small, swallowed by the quiet. The drive-in was long, dirt roads winding through thick trees on both sides. The last stretch was rough, and my old car kicked up dust, the tires crunching on gravel and dry leaves. I wasn't expecting anyone around for miles, and that was exactly why I chose this spot. The nearest neighbor was supposed to be about a mile away. I figured that was close enough if something went wrong, but far enough to be alone. The cabin itself was small and rough. A single story with wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and one bedroom. Inside smelled like old wooden pine. It was rustic but comfortable, with a stack of firewood by the door and a couple of cans of food left behind. No electricity, just a few candles and a propane lantern I brought with me. I arrived in the late afternoon and spent a while unpacking and getting settled. I lit a fire in the hearth and watched the flames crackle, the smoke curling up the chimney. The forest was alive with sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling, twigs snapping under small animals' feet. I thought it was perfect, peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you forget all the noise outside. That first night, I sat by the fire reading an old book I'd brought, wrapped in a thick blanket. The sky outside had turned a deep, velvety black, the stars sharp and clear between the tree branches. Somewhere in the distance, a hoot of an owl echoed through the night. I felt relaxed. Then I heard the car. It was faint at first, a distant rumble on the dirt road that led past the cabin. I paused, listening, my heart tightening a little. That was strange. I hadn't expected anyone else out here. The sound grew louder, tires crunching on gravel, engines slowing. Then silence. I looked out the window, peering into the dark, but saw nothing. No headlights, no figure walking toward me, no other car parked nearby. I waited a few minutes, feeling a little nervous, but nothing happened. The car must have stopped just down the road for a moment and then driven off. I told myself it was probably someone from the neighboring property just passing by or checking the area. But it was strange that no one came to visit or at least called out. The forest was too quiet after that, like it had swallowed the noise whole. The next day, I drove into the nearby town to buy some supplies. At the local store, I asked a few people about the cabin's neighbor. They gave me strange looks, avoiding eye contact. Finally, one older man told me quietly that the last person living in the house down the road had disappeared a few months back. No one knew what happened. The place had been empty since. That was a shock. The neighbor's truck, I'd seen it parked there the day before, but the house was dark, empty, and silent. No lights, no smoke from a chimney, no signs of life. I drove back to the cabin, my mind buzzing with questions. The woods felt darker somehow, less friendly. I decided to keep a closer watch. That evening, I sat by the fire again, trying to relax. But the woods around the cabin seemed to close in tighter, the shadows long and twisting under the moonlight. I kept hearing things, soft footsteps on the wooden porch, the creak of floorboards as if someone had just walked by outside. I looked out, but saw nothing but trees swaying gently in the night breeze. The footsteps kept coming, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The sound of leaves crunching just beyond the porch, the soft tapping of something moving through brush. I convinced myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the steps felt heavier, more purposeful. Later, faint whispers drifted in from the woods, so soft I could barely hear them. The sound was almost like someone talking low, hushed voices just out of reach. I froze and listened, but the whispers faded as quickly as they came. The silence after was worse. Around midnight, a knocking came, 3 light taps on the cabin door. I jumped. My heart hammered so loud I thought it might burst. I didn't move for a long moment. Then I grabbed the flashlight and swung open the door quickly, shining the beam out into the dark. Nothing, just the empty porch and thick woods beyond. I checked every corner inside and outside the cabin. No footprints in the dirt, no signs that anyone had been there. No car or light down the road. Nothing but the cold night air and rustling leaves. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting by the fire with the door locked tight behind me. I wondered if I'd imagined the knocking or if someone had tried to scare me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The neighbor's house was close enough to see from the cabin porch, an old, weather-beaten wooden structure with peeling paint and broken windows. No curtains in the windows, no sign of recent life. The truck was still parked in the driveway, covered with dirt and leaves as if it hadn't been moved in weeks. I circled the house quietly, watching for any sign of movement or someone hiding inside. There was none, but I found strange marks on the ground near the porch. Deep footprints that didn't look like they belonged to any animal I knew, wider and heavier. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the footsteps on my porch started again, louder this time, slower. The knocks on the door came again, faint and scattered. The whispers returned, low and unclear, like a conversation in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to record the sounds on my phone, but the battery died after a few minutes. I felt like the forest was closing in around me, watching, waiting. The air grew colder and my skin crawled. I didn't sleep much. Every noise made me jump. The wind howled through the trees, sounding almost like voices calling my name. I kept the fire burning, but the shadows seemed to move in the flickering light. On the 3rd day, I woke early and decided to leave. I packed quickly, the strange feelings piling on me like a weight. Before I left, I walked once more to the neighbor's house, this time circling the property thoroughly. No sign of anyone, no movement, just silence and the heavy feeling of being watched. As I started the car, I looked back one last time. The neighbor's truck sat still, as it had for days, and the house stood empty and dark. Driving away, I realized I didn't want to know what had happened there. The footsteps, the whispers, the knocks, they weren't ghosts or stories. They were warnings, maybe from someone still out there or something left behind. I didn't look back again. The woods swallowed the cabin behind me. Quiet once more, hiding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a writing retreat. I needed quiet, somewhere I could focus without the noise of the city. The listing was perfect, old but sturdy, with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and enough space for me to spread out my notebooks and laptop. The photos showed a cozy living room with a big window looking out over the trees, a simple bedroom upstairs, and a basement that was supposed to be just for storage. The host said it was clean and safe, and I liked that it was remote enough that no one would bother me. The first day I arrived, I unpacked slowly, taking in the silence that settled around the place like a thick blanket. The air smelled fresh, piney, and cool, with the faint scent of damp earth from the recent rain. I made a fire in the stove and sat down at the table with my notebook, ready to start writing. It was peaceful, just the way I wanted it. Later that afternoon, as I was exploring the cabin a bit more, I noticed something strange. There was a door in the basement I hadn't seen in the photos or read about in the listing. The basement was under the main floor, accessed by a narrow wooden staircase. When I first checked it out, I just glanced around. There were old boxes and some broken furniture. But now, standing at the bottom of the stairs, I saw a small, heavy door set into the far wall. It was locked tight. The paint on the door was chipped and faded, and there was no sign of a handle on the inside. I went back upstairs and looked again at the listing and the photos. No mention of this door. I figured the host forgot to tell me about it, or maybe it was a part of the old cabin that had been sealed off years ago. Curiosity nagged at me all afternoon. I tried to ignore it while I wrote, but I kept thinking about what might be behind that door. I checked around the basement again, looking for a key or any clue. That's when I found it, hidden under the kitchen mat, taped to the back with a small piece of clear Scotch tape. The key was old and rusty, but matched the lock perfectly. I hesitated before using it. There was a strange feeling in my stomach, like a warning I didn't want to listen to, but I decided I had to know. The lock clicked open, and I pushed the door slowly. It swung open to a small, narrow room that smelled terrible, wet and musty with a sharp metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. The air was cold and thick, almost like it was holding its breath. Inside, the floor was dirt covered with old, broken floorboards. I saw old clothes scattered across the floor, torn shirts, pants, and a pair of boots covered in mud. It looked like they'd been left behind in a hurry. Mixed in with the clothes were rusty tools. Hammers, screwdrivers, pliers, and a few long metal rods that looked bent and dangerous. Some of the tools were covered in a dark brown crust that looked like dried blood. I stepped in carefully, feeling the cold seep through my shoes. The walls were rough and uneven, like stone, but covered in a thin layer of damp plaster that was cracking and peeling. The ceiling was low, and I had to duck to avoid hitting my head on a wooden beam. There were no windows, just that small door behind me. The only light came from the basement stairs. I looked around the room slowly. It felt like someone had lived here once, or maybe been trapped here. The scattered clothes and tools gave the place an eerie feeling, like a snapshot of a moment frozen in time, but one filled with panic and fear. I left the door open for a while and went back upstairs, trying to shake off the chill that had settled into my bones. That night, I was lying in bed, trying to write down the scenes I'd imagined for my story. The wind rattled the cabin, and the wood creaked as the temperature dropped. Suddenly, I heard it, heavy breathing coming from below my bedroom, the basement area. My heart jumped. I sat up, listening closely. The breathing was slow but deep, like someone was right under the floor just waiting. Then came the shuffling, slow, scraping noises that sounded like footsteps moving just below the floorboards. I told myself it had to be the wind or some animal, but I knew the cabin well enough to know those sounds weren't normal. It felt like something was moving deliberately, maybe pacing back and forth. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, trying not to make noise as I crept to the stairs leading down. When I got to the basement door, it was locked tight again. I fumbled with the key under the mat, the one I'd found earlier, but it wasn't there. The key was gone. I checked every corner of the kitchen mat, looked under furniture, behind the stove, everywhere. Nothing. The door stayed locked. I stood there in the dark hallway, flashlight in hand, listening. The breathing was quieter now, but still there, and the shuffling hadn't stopped. The air felt thick with something I couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or the weight of secrets. I couldn't stay there. I went back upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and sat by the window, staring out at the dark woods until dawn. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, not wanting to spend another night in that cabin. Before I left, I looked at the basement door one last time. The lock looked new, like someone had put it there recently. I tried to open it with the key I found before, but it didn't work anymore. As I walked out to my car, the sun rising behind the trees, I felt the weight of that room pressing down on me. I didn't want to know what had happened down there or why the door was locked again. I never went back, and I never told anyone the full story because who would believe me? But every time I think about that cabin, the heavy breathing and the locked door, I remember that some places keep their secrets locked tight, and some doors are better left unopened. The morning was crisp when I set out for my cabin. I had planned this solo trip for weeks, just me, the woods, and a quiet lake a few miles away. I wanted to escape the noise, the buzz of the city, and just breathe in fresh air for a while. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled deep in a forest where cell signal was patchy at best, and no one around for miles except maybe the odd hunter or hiker passing through. I liked that isolation. It made me feel alive, even if sometimes a little on edge. I packed a light bag with water, some snacks, a small first aid kit, and a map I had carefully studied the night before. The trail to the lake was rugged but marked, winding through thick pines and patches of wildflowers. Birds sang overhead, and the sun filtered down through the leaves, making the dirt path warm in spots and cool in others. I walked steady, enjoying the crunch of twigs and leaves under my boots. The air smelled of pine resin and earth. After about an hour, I hit a clearing, a small open area where the sun shone bright and the forest fell silent except for the wind rustling through the trees. I paused, took a drink of water, and looked ahead. The path continued, curving slightly to the right and dipping down a gentle slope. I felt good, relaxed, but then something caught my eye in the dirt. Fresh footprints. They were large, maybe 8 or 9 inches long, and the tread looked deep, like whoever made them was heavy or wearing thick boots. What froze me was that the prints weren't just there. They were right behind mine, following the same path. My heart started to beat a little faster. I stopped walking. For a few seconds, I just stared at the ground, then lifted my eyes slowly. No one was there. No sound but the wind and distant bird calls. I waited, standing perfectly still, hoping to see or hear something, anyone. But nothing came. No footsteps ahead, no snapping branches, no voices. Just silence. I shook my head and forced myself to move on, telling myself it could be an old hunter, maybe someone else using the trail earlier this morning. It didn't make much sense. Why would they follow so closely behind me? But I pushed the thought away and kept going, trying to ignore the tight feeling creeping into my chest. The rest of the hike was uneventful, or so I thought. The lake was beautiful, a calm, clear pool of water surrounded by tall trees that reflected perfectly on its surface. I sat on a fallen log, took off my boots, and dangled my feet in the water. It was cold but refreshing. I stayed there for a while, just listening to the quiet and feeling the sun warm my back. After about an hour, I stood up and decided to head back. The day was already getting late, and I wanted to get back before dark. The forest took on a different tone on the return trip. Shadows lengthened, and the wind seemed colder. I quickened my pace, wanting to reach the safety of the cabin. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, relief washed over me. But as I drew closer, my stomach sank. Around the cabin was the same set of heavy footprints, fresh and deep, circling the perimeter. They ran along the sides of the cabin, crossed just beneath the windows and disappeared into the trees on the far side. My hands clenched into fists, breath shallow. The doors were locked tight. I checked before I left, and I checked again just now from outside. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks. I crouched down and examined the prints. The tread pattern matched the ones I'd seen on the trail. Whoever had followed me to the lake had come all the way back and circled my cabin without ever knocking or trying to open the doors. It was like they were watching, waiting. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting the cabin in a gloomy half-light. I double-checked all the locks and windows, then went inside and bolted every door and window again. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, sleep was restless. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the wood floor, the wind tapping against the windows. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife on the bedside table, ready. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, just nature or maybe another hiker, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. Morning came, but brought no comfort. When I pulled back the curtains on the window by the bed, a new sight froze me in place. Scratched deep into the glass, barely legible but clear enough, were words I hadn't seen before. Don't leave. The scratches were fresh, the glass rough where someone had clawed or scraped their fingers against it. I pressed my palm to the window, heart hammering. No one else was supposed to be anywhere near this cabin. I was the only person for miles, the only one using this trail and this lake. I spent the rest of the day inside, double locking every door and closing every window. I sat by the windows, watching the woods like a wild animal. The footprints remained outside, circling the cabin as if marking territory or sending a message. The thought of leaving felt impossible. I couldn't step outside without knowing someone was out there watching, waiting. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe a hunter or a poacher who didn't want me here. Maybe a lost hiker or someone who followed the same trail and got curious. But why wouldn't they just approach or try to talk? Why leave the message? Why the silence? The next day, I found more footprints, not just around the cabin, but leading away into the woods in several directions, like someone was testing the boundaries, trying to figure out where I might go. I stayed inside, gathering supplies, making sure I had everything ready in case I had to leave suddenly. I checked my phone again, still no signal. No way to call for help. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the forest was thick enough to hide anyone. By the third day, exhaustion was setting in. I barely slept, barely ate. Every noise outside made me jump. I didn't even want to look out the windows anymore. Then I noticed something else. The footprints were changing. They were bigger now, heavier, deeper in the soft earth. More scattered. Sometimes they appeared close to the back door, sometimes at the front, and sometimes, in the early morning light, I saw marks on the trees, scratches like claws, not deep but fresh. The message scratched into the window felt like a warning, a boundary. I understood then that this wasn't random. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wanting me to stay put, to not go anywhere. I spent hours pacing the cabin, wondering how to get out safely. I thought about waiting for the footprints to disappear, but they didn't. They only grew more frequent and more menacing. One evening, the sun had just set when I noticed movement near the edge of the woods. A shadow shifted, blending with the darkening trees. I couldn't see a face or figure clearly, but I felt eyes on me. My breath caught and I froze. The shadow didn't move closer, didn't retreat. It just watched. I realized then there was no escape unless I was willing to risk everything. The next morning, I packed my bag quickly, quietly, preparing to leave at first light. I had no plan to tell anyone where I was going. If I made it out, I'd figure it out then. At dawn, I stepped outside, the cold morning air biting my skin. I kept my head down, moving fast toward the trail. My heart pounded with every step, ears straining for any sound. Behind me, the footprints trailed close. They followed me as always, but I didn't look back. The forest was thick and uneven, the trail rough. After a mile or so, I heard a branch snap, sharp and sudden behind me. I ran, pushing through the underbrush, branches scratching my face and arms. The sound of footsteps, heavier now, crashing through leaves and twigs, was right behind. I didn't stop until the trees thinned, and the first sign of the road came into view. My legs burned, lungs heaving, but I kept going, hoping someone would be on the road. Just as I reached the dirt road, I heard nothing behind me anymore. No footsteps, no sounds. The forest was quiet again. I didn't stop to look back. I kept walking until I found a cabin closer to a main road, a place where people stayed regularly. I got help, told my story in breathless fragments, but no one believed the footprints or the message. They said it was probably some local playing a prank, but I knew better. After that, I never returned to the cabin. I sold it quietly, never told anyone exactly why. Sometimes when I'm out hiking now, I still see footprints that don't belong to me, heavy and silent, following just out of sight. I learned something important in those woods. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see or hear. It's knowing something is out there, watching, waiting, and making sure you know you're not alone, even when you are. I was dog-sitting at a friend's cabin deep in the woods, a place far from town with no internet or cell phone service. My friend had asked me to watch over the place while they were out of state for a couple of weeks. The cabin was old but well-kept, made of weathered logs with a tin roof that creaked softly whenever the wind picked up. It sat near a small lake, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked most of the sunlight during the day, leaving the whole area shaded and cool. I liked the quiet at first, the kind of quiet where you can hear the wind slip through the branches or the distant call of a loon on the lake. It felt peaceful and easy, a break from the noise of the city. The dog I was watching was a medium-sized golden retriever named Buddy. He was calm most of the time, but sometimes got nervous at night. I made sure to keep the fire going in the stone fireplace and kept the lights on in the living room until late, just to make the place feel less empty. The cabin had a small kitchen, a few bedrooms, and a porch that overlooked the lake. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy enough. One evening, after Buddy had eaten and settled by the fireplace, I was sitting on the couch flipping through a book when I noticed something odd near the base of the living room wall. There was a small panel. One of the wooden boards looked loose and slightly out of place. I hadn't seen it before, and it seemed unusual because the rest of the cabin was well maintained. The panel wasn't nailed down tight, and it shifted a little when I pressed on it. Curiosity got the better of me. I carefully pried the panel open and found a tiny camera hidden inside the wall cavity behind it. The camera was about the size of a deck of cards, but much thinner, with a small lens pointing out through a hole in the wood. It was dusty, as if it had been there for a while. I immediately felt a cold rush of unease. Why would there be a camera hidden in the wall? Since there was no internet or cell service to stream the footage, I looked around for a way to access the recordings. The camera had a slot for an SD card, and I saw one partially sticking out. I pulled it out gently, careful not to damage it. Then, using my laptop, I plugged the SD card into the reader. The files were there, organized by date and time. I started watching the footage. At first, it was just the empty cabin, shadows moving as the sun shifted, the occasional flicker of light from the fireplace. But then, the unsettling part began. On several dates over the past few weeks, someone had entered the cabin while it was supposed to be empty. The footage showed a person slowly walking through the rooms, looking around carefully as if checking for anything valuable or important. Their face was never clearly visible. They stayed mostly in shadow, wearing a hoodie pulled low over their head. The person didn't steal anything or damage the cabin, but they moved around as if they knew the layout well. They stopped in front of the cabinets, looked through drawers, and even approached the dog's bed, where Buddy usually slept. On one clip, the person even paused at the window facing the lake and stared outside for several minutes, as if waiting for something or someone. What scared me most wasn't that someone had been inside the cabin. It was that they had been watching it quietly for weeks without me knowing. I checked the timestamps. The visits happened at night, and sometimes during the day when no one was around. The dates matched the time since my friend had left for their trip. I locked the panel back up and hid the camera in my bag. The whole night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and sometimes the faint sound of footsteps. Buddy was restless too, pacing and whining. I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows before finally falling asleep on the couch with Buddy at my feet. The next day, I reported what I found to the local police. I gave them the camera and the SD card. They said they would look into it, but because there was no clear image of the intruder and no signs of forced entry, their options were limited. They told me they'd patrol the area more often and keep an eye out, but they couldn't promise much without more evidence. Days passed, and I stayed alert, always checking the locks and watching the woods around the cabin. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every creak and snap in the forest made me jump. I stopped going outside after dark and kept Buddy close. The camera footage was the only proof I had, but it didn't show the person's face, and there was no way to identify them. When my friend returned, I told them everything. They were shocked, but not surprised. Apparently, the cabin had been broken into before, years ago, but no one was ever caught. They had never installed security cameras because of the remote location and lack of service. The hidden camera must have been put in by the previous owners or even by my friend themselves as a precaution. Neither of them had remembered it until now. I left the cabin feeling uneasy, knowing someone had been there, moving around the place I thought was safe. Even though the police couldn't find the intruder, I knew the truth. Someone had been watching the cabin, maybe even following my friend's movements. The thought that this person could still be out there, nearby, made me not want to stay there alone again. In the end, I understood that the woods and quiet places don't always mean peace. Sometimes they just hide secrets better than the city ever could. And no matter how much you lock your doors or check your windows, some things slip in unseen. The camera was the only thing that caught it, but even that wasn't enough to stop it. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a break from the city, some fresh air, a few days away in the woods with friends. We had rented a small cabin tucked deep into the forest, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The kind of place that looked perfect on the outside. Rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney with smoke curling out, a front porch with a creaky swing, and windows that caught the last golden light of the day. It was the kind of cabin you'd expect to see in a movie about a peaceful getaway, not a place where something could go wrong. Our group was 5 people. Me, Josh, Mia, Ethan, and Luke, the one who disappeared. Luke was the quietest of us, a guy who usually kept to himself, but was easygoing enough to fit in with anyone. We all thought this trip would be fun, a chance to get away from our phones, screens, and the noise of everyday life. The first day was exactly that, quiet and easy. We unpacked, lit a fire in the stone hearth, cooked some burgers on the small grill outside, and drank a little too much around the campfire. The woods around us were dense with tall pine and fir trees, the ground thick with needles and the smell of damp earth. The air felt clean and heavy, like it was holding its breath. That night, after the fire died down and the stars took over the sky, we all went to bed early, tired from the long drive and the fresh air. The cabin's walls were thin, and the wind howled outside like it was trying to push its way inside. The wooden floor creaked, sometimes under the weight of the cold, and every little sound seemed louder in the silence. I woke up first the next morning. The cabin was cold, and the air felt heavier than the night before. I noticed Luke's bed was empty, no sign he had been there. I thought maybe he had gotten up early and gone outside, maybe for a walk or to use the outhouse behind the cabin. I didn't think much of it. Breakfast was quiet. No one mentioned Luke. When he didn't show up for coffee, Mia asked if he was okay. Ethan said he saw Luke packing a small backpack before bed, but no one had any idea where he could be. We assumed he had gone for a hike, maybe wanted some alone time. By mid-morning, we started to worry. Luke hadn't come back, and his phone was off. We decided to search around the cabin, calling his name and walking through the trees. The forest was thick and uneven. Every step we took sunk into moss or scattered dry leaves. The sunlight struggled through the high canopy, and the woods seemed darker and colder than they had the day before. We followed a trail that Luke might have taken. It was narrow and rough, worn by old hikers, but not used much. After about an hour, we found something. Fresh footprints in the soft dirt, small and light. They looked like Luke's shoes. They led from the cabin's edge and went deeper into the forest. We followed the footprints for miles, sometimes pushing through thick brush and stepping over fallen logs. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the snap of twigs underfoot. We called Luke's name, but there was no answer. Then the footprints stopped. Right in the middle of a small clearing, they just ended. There was no sign Luke had gone further. No broken branches, no bent grass, nothing. Just a circle of dirt and leaves, like he had vanished into thin air. It didn't make any sense. We searched the area carefully, shining flashlights in every direction. Nothing. No trace of him. No dropped backpack. No torn clothing. No sign of struggle. It was like Luke had walked into the forest and disappeared. That night, we stayed in the cabin. None of us could sleep. The silence inside felt thicker, heavier, like the walls themselves were watching us. The usual creaks and groans of the cabin felt sharper, more ominous. The wind outside was louder, and shadows seemed to move just beyond the windows. 2 days later, we still hadn't found Luke. We expanded the search, calling the police, who brought in trackers and search dogs. The dogs followed the trail to the edge of the woods, but they lost the scent where the footprints had stopped. Then something strange happened. Near a trailhead almost 10 miles from the cabin, someone found Luke's phone lying in the dirt by the side of the road. It was dirty and scratched, but mostly intact. We couldn't understand why it was there, so far from the cabin and the last place we saw him. I picked it up with shaking hands and turned it on. The battery was almost dead, but there was one last message from Luke to me. It read, "If I don't make it back, don't look for me." That message hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the kind of thing people say when they're scared or giving up hope. It felt like Luke was warning me, or maybe telling me to stop searching. But how could I? After that, the cabin felt different. Not the cozy place it had been. It was like the silence in the walls had grown heavier, like the air inside was waiting for something to happen. The firewood seemed to rot faster. The windows fogged up with cold even when the stove was running. At night, the creaks and knocks came more often, but nothing explained them. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breath sound loud and frantic. We never found Luke. The search was called off after a week, but none of us stopped thinking about him. The forest was the last place anyone saw him, but no one could say what had really happened. Looking back, I realized something about the cabin and the woods around it. There's a weight to that place, something that settles on you when the sun goes down and the trees crowd close. It's not ghosts or monsters, it's something else. A reminder that in the wild, people can just disappear. No signs, no answers. Sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear the wind around the cabin in my head, like it's waiting, just like the cabin was. And I think about Luke walking deeper into the forest, leaving those footprints behind, and then nothing. No one ever finds what goes missing out there. I had planned this hike for weeks. I was going to spend 3 days alone in the woods, somewhere remote, where cell phones wouldn't work and no one would bother me. I needed that kind of quiet. No noise, no people, just me and the trail. I picked a place I'd been to before, but never went deep into the old forest near the edge of town that was thick with tall pine and fir trees, rocky ridges, and a few creeks running through. I'd done some shorter hikes there, but never camped overnight. I packed carefully, my backpack with a small tent, a sleeping bag, water purifier, canned food, a little stove, some first aid stuff, a flashlight, and extra batteries. I told one friend roughly where I'd be and when to expect me back, just in case. I wasn't carrying a gun or anything like that. I wanted to keep it simple. The morning started cool and clear. The sun was just rising when I left my car at the small parking lot near the trailhead. The air smelled fresh and sharp, like pine needles and wet earth. I tightened the straps on my backpack, adjusted my hat, and started walking. The trail was narrow and covered with fallen leaves and pine needles. My boots crunched softly on the ground. Birds sang high up in the trees, and every once in a while, I heard the distant tapping of a woodpecker. The forest was alive but calm. I felt good being out here, the kind of good that only comes when you're far away from all the noise. I walked steadily, keeping a good pace but not rushing. My plan was to hike deep in the forest on the first day, find a good campsite near a creek, set up camp, and rest. I check my watch every now and then, but mostly let myself get lost in the sounds around me. The trail wound up and down hills, crossed small streams on old wooden bridges, and curved between thick groups of trees. Moss covered some of the rocks, and I saw little mushrooms growing in the shade. After a couple of hours, I came to a fork in the trail. One path went left, leading up a steep slope toward a rocky ridge. The other turned right, heading down to a valley where the creek ran. I paused, pulled out a map from my backpack, and checked the route. I wanted to go to the creek first. It would be good to fill up on water and maybe find a spot to camp for the night. The path to the creek was narrower and less traveled. I noticed that fewer footprints were visible, and the forest felt quieter here. The trees grew closer together, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. My steps stirred the dry leaves and twigs, and I kept an eye on the trail markers painted on tree trunks, making sure I stayed on track. When I reached the creek, I stopped to rest. The water was clear and cold, rushing softly over smooth stones. I took out my water bottle and filled it, then set up my purifier. The sound of the creek was soothing, almost hypnotic. I found a flat spot nearby, free of brush and rocks, and started to unpack my tent. Setting up camp took some time. I found a place between two trees where the ground was level. The smell of damp earth and pine filled the air. I spread out my sleeping bag inside the tent and laid out my gear neatly. After finishing, I boiled some water on my little stove and heated a can of beans. The food was simple but satisfying. As the afternoon slipped into evening, the light dimmed and the forest changed. Shadows grew longer, and the coolness of the day gave way to a chill that crept into my bones. The birds quieted down, and the only sounds were the creek and the wind whispering through the trees. I wrapped myself in my jacket and sat outside my tent, listening. By nightfall, the forest was nearly silent except for the crackle of the fire I built carefully just a few feet from my tent. The smoke curled upward, disappearing into the darkness. I stared into the flames, feeling the warmth on my face. Above me, the sky was clear, stars shining bright and countless. It was peaceful, but that peace didn't last long. Somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard a noise. It wasn't a shout or a scream, just a faint sound that made me stop. I strained my ears. A rustle? A snap of a twig? It was hard to tell. My heart sped up slightly, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal moving about. The forest was full of life at night. I decided to go to bed early. I zipped up my tent and crawled inside. The night was cold, but my sleeping bag kept me warm. I listened to the creek nearby, steady and constant. Eventually, my eyes closed. Hours later, I woke suddenly. The silence was broken. Outside the tent, there was a loud noise, something big crashing through the brush. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. The sound came closer, crunching leaves, snapping branches, heavy footsteps. I unzipped the tent, just a crack, and shone my flashlight into the dark. The beam caught movement about 20 feet away. A large animal stood there. It wasn't a bear, too slender and tall. It was a man. He was wearing a dark jacket and pants, his face hidden in the shadows. He looked around as if searching for something. My mouth went dry, but I stayed quiet and still. I thought about the friend I told where I was. If this guy was dangerous, I had to stay calm. After a few minutes, he turned and walked away without noticing me. I watched him disappear between the trees, heart racing. I waited a long time before closing the tent and trying to sleep again. The next morning, I broke camp quickly. The air felt heavy. I wasn't sure what to make of the man I saw. Why was he here? Did he live nearby? Was he dangerous? I tried not to think about it as I headed back the way I came. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The trail looked disturbed. Fresh footprints mixed with my own. Small broken branches, as if someone had been moving off the path, closer to my campsite. My stomach twisted. Had he followed me? I kept going faster, checking behind me often. The forest felt different now, less welcoming. The peaceful sounds were replaced by an uneasy quiet. I stayed on the trail, careful not to lose the markers. My mind raced with every snap and rustle. Halfway back to the parking lot, I heard voices. Not loud, but clear enough. Men's voices talking quietly, close by. I stepped off the trail and hid behind a tree. Peering around the trunk, I saw two men. They wore heavy boots, dark clothes, and carried backpacks. They were too far to hear what they said, but they looked rough, like they spent a lot of time in the woods. They hadn't seen me. I stayed still until they moved on down the path. My heart hammered so hard I thought they might hear it. I made it back to the car in record time. Hands shaking, I locked the doors and sat down, catching my breath. I didn't wait around. I drove home as fast as I could, looking in my rearview mirror every few minutes. Later, I called my friend and told him everything. He told me to never go back to that part of the forest. People like that, hunters, squatters, maybe worse, were known to roam there, especially at night. I realized that being alone in the woods wasn't always peaceful or safe. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about real danger. People who didn't want to be found. People who might see you as an intruder. That trip changed the way I think about hiking alone. Now, I always carry a way to call for help. I stick to well-known trails, and I never camp without telling someone exactly where I am. The forest is beautiful, but it's also full of things you can't see coming. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that man standing just outside my tent in the dark. It's a reminder that the wilderness isn't just nature. It's also people, and some of them don't belong there. Not for good reasons, anyway. From that day on, I never forgot to respect the quiet woods, and more importantly, the unknown people who might be out there too. The wind was howling hard that afternoon, and the rain was coming down in thick sheets. I was somewhere near the Idaho-Montana border, deep in the wilderness on my Continental Divide trail through hike. The weather had turned for the worse over the past few hours. The sky was thick with dark clouds, and the trees bent and creaked under the pressure of the wind. I knew that being out here, miles from any road or shelter, in weather like this was always dangerous, but I kept moving, hoping to make good time before nightfall. The trail was slick with mud, slippery rocks, and fallen pine needles that stuck to my boots like glue. My rain jacket was soaked through despite its waterproof shell, and my breath came out in visible puffs as the cold wind sliced through the forest. I wasn't in any hurry to stop, but the rain and wind made everything feel slower, heavier. The trees all around me groaned and swayed, the way old trees do when a storm threatens to rip them loose. I was moving along a narrow section of trail, flanked by dense forest on both sides. The pine trees here were tall, ancient giants. Some had trunks as wide as a small car. Their roots twisted out of the ground and tangled with the underbrush, making footing tricky. I was watching my step, leaning into the wind, when suddenly I heard a loud, cracking noise above me. It wasn't like the usual creak of the forest in the wind. It was sharper, more violent, like with snapping under enormous pressure. I froze, looking up just in time to see a huge pine tree ahead of me, maybe 70 or 80 feet tall, starting to tilt. At first, it was slow, almost graceful in the way the top of the tree leaned over the trail. Then it picked up speed. The whole crown of the tree bent like it was made of rubber, swooping in a smooth arc directly towards me. My brain took a moment to catch up. I couldn't quite understand what I was seeing. Trees didn't just bend like that, not whole mature pines with trunks that thick. The crown moved in a way that was almost impossible. It seemed to twist and stretch as it came closer. I was caught in a moment where time slowed, and everything felt unreal. My feet felt stuck to the ground, my eyes wide and locked on the giant tree falling straight for me. Then I remembered something, a scene from the movie Prometheus, where the characters are running from this huge, rolling, killing machine. They all ran in a straight line, right into its path, and died. But one character had the clarity to veer off sideways, out of its direct path, and survived. That split-second thought cut through the panic in my mind. I knew I couldn't just stand there. Without thinking, I twisted my body hard and stepped sharply off the trail, moving sideways toward the dense trees on the edge. The rain pelted my face, my boots slipping on the wet ground as the tree crashed down right where I had been standing seconds before. It landed lengthwise across the trail, the broken trunk stretching out for at least 60 feet, its branches scraping the ground like giant claws. The sound was deafening, with snapping, branches smashing, the tree hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The impact sent a cloud of wet dirt and pine needles into the air. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I stayed crouched low, staring at the fallen tree for a long moment, my mind still racing to process what had just happened. Once the noise faded, the forest went eerily quiet. The wind had died down a little, but the rain still fell steadily, the steady patter mixing with the distant rumble of thunder. I was so cold and shaking, but I was alive. The trail was now completely blocked by the giant tree. No way I could climb over or around it without risking injury or getting stuck. That day, the forest didn't feel friendly or safe. It felt indifferent, powerful, and sometimes deadly. The narrow trail cut through miles of wilderness, and out here, you're not just dealing with rough terrain or bad weather. You're facing the raw forces of nature that can turn against you without warning. I found a spot just off the trail where I could rest for a moment, trying to calm my shaking hands. I pulled out my map and checked my location, thinking about what to do next. The tree meant I had to backtrack a few miles to find a side trail or a safer route. The storm wasn't going anywhere soon, and I knew I'd have to move carefully if I wanted to keep going. The wind picked up again, whipping through the branches overhead like a low growl. As I started hiking back, I thought about all the other close calls I'd had on this trip. Earlier that week, I'd almost stepped on a rattlesnake. It was hiding under a pile of dry leaves just off the trail. I was watching the ground closely, trying to avoid slippery spots when I spotted the thick, patterned coils right where my boot was going to land. The snake rattled its tail violently, a sharp warning that sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I froze for a second, heart racing, then carefully stepped back and circled wide around it. That encounter reminded me how easy it is to make a mistake out here and how careful you have to be. Then there was the night I spent camped in a small clearing near a creek. I had pitched my tent early, tired from the day's hike, but around dusk I started hearing noises outside. At first, it was the usual forest sounds, birds settling in, insects buzzing. But then I heard something heavier, something moving slowly, but deliberately just beyond my tent's mesh screen. It was a bear. I could hear its breath, the crunch of its paws on the wet leaves. It stayed nearby for hours, persistent but not aggressive. I didn't dare make a sound or move, knowing that any sudden noise might provoke it. I sat in the dark, listening to the bear's heavy breathing until dawn finally broke and it wandered off. That night taught me that even when you're alone and tired, you're never truly alone in the wilderness. The animals know the trails as well as you do, and sometimes they don't want to give up their space. Back on the trail that rainy afternoon, after the tree had fallen, I felt a strange mix of relief and caution. The forest was beautiful, wild, and unpredictable. It didn't care about my plans or my pace. It reminded me that survival out here depends on respect for the land, the weather, and the creatures that live in it. I made my way back the way I came, slipping and sliding through mud, keeping my eyes open for anything else that might threaten me. The storm started to ease just as I reached a small ridge, where I found a natural shelter under some big rocks and a dense thicket of trees. I set up my tarp quickly, grateful for the break in the rain. That day, I learned how close you can come to disaster without even realizing it until the last second. The tree could have crushed me in an instant, but a moment of clear thinking saved me. I kept telling myself that wasn't luck. It was respect and awareness paying off. The forest never stopped teaching me its harsh lessons on that trail. Every step, every breath in the cold, wet air reminded me why I had chosen this path, to test myself, to feel alive. And as the wind died down and the rain turned to a gentle drizzle, I settled in for the night, exhausted but alive, knowing I'd be back on the trail come morning, ready for whatever came next. This past summer, my girlfriend, my sister, and I flew out to Montana for the first time. We had planned a short trip just to explore and get out of the city, and when we landed early afternoon on a bright, clear July day, we felt nothing but excitement. The sky was wide and blue, with just a few fluffy clouds scattered far away. The air smelled fresh and piney as soon as we stepped off the plane. We barely waited to get our bags before deciding, let's go hiking right now. We rented a car and drove about 45 minutes from the airport to one of the popular hiking spots we had read about online. It was a moderately challenging trail, mostly through dense forest with some open meadows and a few rocky sections. The trailhead was well marked, and there were a handful of other hikers coming and going when we arrived around 1 p.m. The sun was warm and bright overhead, and the air was dry but not too hot. Perfect hiking weather. We started down the trail at a steady pace, carrying day packs with water, snacks, and some light jackets we brought along, just in case. The forest was thick with tall pine and fir trees, the kind that Montana is famous for. The ground was soft beneath our boots, carpeted with fallen needles and pine cones, and the smell of earth and sap filled the air. Birds were chirping here and there, and we even spotted a few squirrels darting between branches. The trail itself wound gently uphill at first, then flattened out as it snaked deeper into the woods. At first, everything was calm and peaceful. We joked a little, pointed out wildflowers and interesting trees, and soaked in the quiet beauty of the place. But about 2 miles in, things started to change. The bright blue sky began to dull. Clouds rolled in from the west, thickening quickly and blotting out the sun. The air turned cooler, and a faint smell of rain hung in the breeze. We hadn't really thought much about the possibility of a thunderstorm. After all, it was still early afternoon, and it seemed so clear when we arrived. We slowed down, paying more attention to the sky and the wind. The trees started to sway gently as the breeze picked up. I remember feeling a slight unease, like the calm had shifted into something else. My girlfriend and sister said we should turn back if it started to drizzle, and I agreed. Better safe than sorry. Then I heard the first loud boom. It was deep and sharp, echoing through the forest. At first, I thought it was thunder, but it didn't sound right. It was heavier, more powerful, and there was a strange vibration in the air when it hit. The boom was followed by silence that felt almost too quiet. I stopped walking and looked around, trying to spot the storm, but all I could see were darkening clouds. Another boom rang out just a few minutes later. Then another and another, coming faster this time. My heart started to race. I nudged my sister and girlfriend, and we began to turn around, heading back the way we came. The wind was getting stronger, picking up speed and force, whipping pine needles and dirt into our faces. I guess the gusts were hitting close to 40 miles per hour. As we moved faster, the booms grew louder, more constant and closer. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, a full-size pine tree was falling over about 50 feet away, crashing down with a roar like a freight train. It hit the ground hard, sending up a cloud of dust and snapping smaller branches like toothpicks. I yelled for my sister and girlfriend to run, and we broke into a sprint, adrenaline surging through our veins. The trees were falling all around us, toppling over one after another in a terrifying chain reaction. The wind screamed in our ears, and the forest around us turned chaotic and dangerous. Each crash sent vibrations through the ground, and clouds of pine needles and dirt swirling in the air. I glanced back once, and my stomach dropped. There were trees falling behind us and to the sides, some landing only yards away. My sister was just ahead of me when a massive pine came crashing down right behind her, missing her by mere seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The sound of snapping wood and crashing trees was constant, a deafening roar mixed with the shrieking wind. We pushed harder, running without looking back, dodging branches and uneven ground as best we could. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but the fear kept me moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, the storm started to lose strength. The trees falling slowed and then stopped, leaving only the wind howling through the broken forest. We reached the trailhead, breathless and shaken, with dirt and pine needles stuck to our clothes and faces. None of us were hurt, but the experience left us stunned and silent. We sat on a fallen log and tried to catch our breath, listening to the eerie quiet that had returned, broken only by the rustle of the wind through the damaged trees. The next day, despite our fear from the previous afternoon, we decided to hike the full trail. We wanted to understand exactly what had happened and see the damage for ourselves. The sky was clear again, the sun shining bright as if nothing had happened. But the forest looked different. Every few steps, we had to climb over or go around fallen trees. Some were huge, with thick trunks that looked like they belonged to giants, now lying like kindling across the trail. We counted 25 trees down along just the section we walked. Branches were snapped off, bark peeled away, and pine needles crushed under the weight of the fallen giants. The trail was scarred, as if a wild beast had run through and torn everything apart. Walking through the devastation, I couldn't shake the memory of that terrifying run. The power of nature was undeniable, calm one moment, violently destructive the next. We kept our eyes peeled for signs of more storms, but the sky stayed blue and peaceful. Still, the memory lingered, a reminder of how quickly things can change when you're out in the wild. We finished the hike with heavy hearts, but a deep respect for the mountain and the forest. That day, Montana showed us its wild side, raw and unrelenting. It was a humbling experience, one that reminded me that no matter how much we prepare, we're still just visitors in a world much bigger and stronger than ourselves. I was hiking alone that morning, except for my buddy who was just a few yards ahead. It was winter in New Hampshire, and we had planned to hike up one of the 4,000 footers, a peak somewhere in the Northeast Mountains. I can't quite remember which one now, but I do remember how cold it was and how the wind was constantly biting in my face beneath my balaclava. We had done plenty of winter hikes together before, so this wasn't my first time dealing with snow, ice, and bitter cold. I had the right gear: micro spikes, insulated boots, a good jacket, warm gloves, and layers that kept me warm but didn't trap sweat. The trail was tough, as usual for this time of the year. The snow had fallen a few days earlier and frozen solid. We'd been moving at a steady pace, careful on the steeper sections where the snow and ice could get slick. The air smelled cold and clean, and my breath formed little clouds as I exhaled. The trees were bare now, skeletal branches reaching out against the gray sky. As we climbed higher, the trees thinned out, revealing the rocky, exposed face of the mountain beneath the snow. That part always gets tricky. The rocks don't just sit there like in summer. The water freezes and cracks and creates sheets of ice that spread over the trail. Sometimes it's almost like walking on glass, especially on the sections where the trail cuts across those ice sheets. Those ice sheets can be wide, flat, and extremely slippery. If you don't have micro spikes or crampons, you're basically asking for trouble. We came upon one of those ice sheets just as the trail turned from uphill to crossing right to left. Before stepping onto the ice, there was a small jump down from the last patch of rocky dirt to the icy section. It wasn't high, maybe a foot or so, but enough that you had to watch your step carefully. I remember feeling the crunch of frozen dirt under my boots as I prepared to land on the ice. I looked down at the glittering sheet, trying to find the best place to put my feet. I stepped forward with my right foot first, the micro spikes digging into the ice. But just as soon as my spikes made contact, something went wrong. I don't even know how it happened. Maybe the spikes caught at a wrong angle, or maybe a patch of slick ice had formed underneath the snow. But my feet slid out from under me. In a split second, I was sitting on my butt sliding downhill. The slide was fast, almost like a scene from a movie. My butt scraped against the ice, and snow sprayed around me in little clouds. I was going feet first, which I think saved me. The trail sloped steeply downward, and if I'd slid head first, I'd probably be hurt worse. The ice sheet stretched maybe 20 feet or so before ending in a sheer drop. I didn't see the drop at first because I was focused on trying to stop myself. But as I slid closer, my heart jumped. The edge was coming up fast. The drop was probably about 15 feet, maybe more. Enough to break a bone if I landed wrong, or worse. I couldn't stop with my legs or hands because the ice was too slippery and my gloves weren't strong enough to grip anything. Just when I thought I was about to go over, I slid right between two small, stunted trees growing close together at the edge. Somehow, I managed to grab both trunks, one hand on each, and that was enough to snap me to a sudden stop. My breath was heavy and sharp in the cold air, my gloves gripping the rough bark tightly. The trees were small and twisted, their branches bare and brittle, but they saved me from falling. I was hanging there, sitting on the ice just above the drop, clutching the trees and trying to catch my breath. For a long moment, I just sat still. I shouted up to my buddy that I was okay, but I needed a moment. My voice sounded small in the vast, empty space of the mountain. I didn't want to move too fast or lose my grip. I was afraid if I rushed, the ice would betray me again. The cold was creeping in through my jacket and gloves, but adrenaline kept me alert. I knew I had to be careful. I looked down the drop, trying to see how bad it really was. The rocks below were jagged and sharp, half covered in snow and ice. I imagined how hard it would be to fall 15 feet onto those rocks, landing awkwardly on my legs or back. I swallowed hard and reminded myself to stay calm. After a few minutes, I started to move carefully. I shifted my weight and managed to inch myself back uphill, scraping my palms against the bark as I went. The micro spikes dug into the ice as I slowly climbed back to solid ground. My legs were shaky, but I stayed steady. I didn't want to test my luck again. When I finally got off the ice, I sat on a nearby rock to catch my breath. My heart was still pounding. I flexed my fingers and toes to warm them up. The cold hadn't broken through completely, but I could feel the chill creeping in. I took a drink of water from my pack, trying to steady my nerves. My buddy came back to check on me, but I just nodded. No need to say much. We both knew how close I'd come to a serious fall. The rest of the hike to the summit felt different. I was more careful, watching every step, testing the ground before putting my weight down. The wind seemed louder, howling through the bare branches. The snow was deeper in places, and every crunch beneath my boots sounded louder in the quiet. When we reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The mountains stretched out all around us, sharp ridges cutting through the white landscape. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun was low, casting long shadows over the snow. It was peaceful up there, cold but calm. I stood for a while, looking out over the range, thinking about how close I had come to falling. The ice sheet had been a small patch on the trail, nothing that looked too dangerous from a distance, but it had nearly ended badly. I thought about how important it was to respect the mountain, to never get careless, even if you're experienced. The hike down was slow and steady. The sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, and the shadows grew long and cold. I kept my eyes on the trail, remembering that one slip could still happen. But I didn't feel scared anymore, just alert, careful, grateful to be alive. When we finally reached the trailhead, my legs were tired but intact. I packed up my gear, feeling the ache from the day's climb and the slide. That moment on the ice stayed with me, clear and sharp in my memory. It was the scariest moment I'd ever had hiking, not because I was foolish or unprepared, but because it reminded me just how quickly things can change on a mountain. The mountain doesn't care about experience or skill. It just is. That day taught me respect. It taught me to always be ready, to move slow when the trail is tricky, and never to underestimate a patch of ice. The mountains are beautiful and brutal, and sometimes the smallest mistake can make the biggest difference. But if you stay alert, stay calm, and respect the trail, you can make it through. I still think about that slide sometimes. I can see it as clear as day, the glittering ice, the sudden rush downhill, the sharp breath caught in my chest when I grabbed those two trees. That moment stopped me, saved me, and in the silence of that cold winter mountain, I learned what it means to survive. The morning started calm enough. My two buddies and I had planned this winter backpacking trip in the Laurel Highlands for weeks. We chose a spot that looked manageable on the map, an approved campsite in one of the valleys. When we pulled up at the trailhead, the ground barely had any snow, just a light dusting that barely covered the dirt and dead leaves. The air was cold, but not biting, the kind of cold you expect in early winter, not the deep freeze that would come later. We packed up and set off down the trail with the weight of our packs on our backs, boots crunching on the light snow. The first few miles were pretty easy. The trail was mostly clear, and the landscape was quiet in that winter way. Bare trees standing stark against the pale sky, a few hardy birds chirping now and then. We were joking around, feeling good, talking about the hike ahead, the food we packed, the fire we'd build at camp. The cold felt manageable, like something to test our gear against, but nothing serious. But as we started to descend into the valley, the snow got thicker, first to our ankles, then to mid-calf. By the time we reached the lowest points, it was coming up past our shins, deep and soft and unbroken except for our footsteps. We had to take turns breaking trail, sinking into the snow with every step. The packs got heavier with each plow, and our breaths came faster and louder in the cold air. It was exhausting work. We didn't fully realize how hard it was going to be until the effort started to drag us down. Our legs burned from the cold and the muscle strain. Our feet felt wet and cold inside our boots despite our best attempts at layering and waterproofing. We pushed through, knowing the campsite was not far ahead, but each step seemed to take twice the energy. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the last stand of trees and saw the clearing where the approved campsite was. The snow was still deep here, but the flat ground made it easier to move around. We started setting up our tents, struggling a bit with the frozen stakes and stiff tent poles. It was late afternoon by then, and the sun was sinking fast. The temperature dropped quickly. The sun vanished behind thick gray clouds, and the wind picked up, slicing through the trees and our layers of clothing. We could feel the cold settling in, deep into our bones. We knew we had to get a fire going fast or risk hypothermia. That's when things started to go wrong. We tried to start the fire the usual way, dry tinder, kindling, then bigger logs, but the snow and cold had soaked everything down deep. Twigs were wet or frozen solid. The dead leaves were brittle but damp, and the larger sticks refused to catch flame. Our fingers were numb and clumsy from the cold, making it hard to work with the matches and lighter. We were all tired, really wiped out from the long, hard trek, and the cold was sapping our energy fast. One of my buddies just collapsed on his sleeping pad, too cold and drained to move or try anymore. He was breathing shallow, his face pale. Another one sat with his legs stretched out, telling us he could no longer feel his feet. The color was gone from them, a pale blue-gray that set off alarm bells in my head. I knew that was the start of frostbite. I felt the panic rising in my chest. We were stuck out here alone, no other campers in sight, no cell signal, no way to call for help. The fire was our only hope to warm up before things got worse. I crawled around the clearing, searching the snow under the Adirondack, chairs we had dragged over from the picnic area. I found a semi-dry stick and began feathering it out with my knife, trying to create enough surface area for the ember to catch. I dug deeper under the chairs and found some dry leaves and small twigs tucked away beneath the snow. Crawling on my hands and knees, I felt the cold creeping through my jacket and pants, but I pushed on. I couldn't give up, not when my friends were relying on me to keep us alive. Slowly, after what felt like forever, I got a spark. The ember caught on the feathered stick, and I carefully blew on it until a tiny flame flickered to life. I added dry leaves, then small twigs, and finally some bigger sticks. The fire grew, giving off heat that felt like a miracle. We gathered close, huddling around the weak flames, trying to dry our gloves and boots and warm our frozen fingers and toes. We ate the food we packed, a mix of energy bars and dehydrated meals. The heat from a fire and the food gave us a little strength back. We were still cold, still exhausted, but at least we were no longer frozen and helpless. I remember my mind being thick with cold and hunger. Everything felt slow and fuzzy. I couldn't think clearly. For the life of me, I could not remember that I had a stove in my backpack. It was right there, tucked away in the side pocket, along with the fuel canisters. Normally, that stove would have been our lifeline, easy and fast to get a hot meal and hot drinks going. But in that moment of foggy brain, I didn't even think of it. I was so focused on the fire we were struggling to build that the stove just slipped from my mind completely. I kept crawling through the snow for dry sticks, trying to keep the fire alive, while my buddies rested and warmed their feet by the flames. It wasn't until the fire was steady that I realized what I'd forgotten. If we had just pulled out the stove earlier, we could have warmed ourselves hours before, maybe avoided the numbness, the near hypothermia feelings. That night stretched on. The wind howled through the valley, shaking the trees and making the fire fight to stay alive. We took turns feeding it bits of wood and snow-dried leaves. Our sleeping bags offered little comfort against the deep chill that seemed to seep into every part of us. We stayed awake, watching the fire and checking each other's feet and hands for signs of frostbite. The cold didn't let up. At one point, I thought about calling for rescue, but there was no signal. We were completely alone. The thought of abandoning camp in the dark and deep snow was too dangerous. When dawn finally came, the temperature was still low, but the wind had calmed. We packed up slowly, still numb, but determined to get out. We took turns breaking trail back through the deep snow, the weight of the packs, and the exhaustion still pressing down on us. It took nearly twice as long to get back to the trailhead. Our legs ached, our feet hurt, but we made it. The sun was shining by then, and the cold didn't seem as sharp. We hobbled to the car, ripped off the cold, wet boots, and breathed in the warm air. Looking back, I realized how close we came to something much worse. The cold and fatigue had clouded my mind, almost made me miss the simple, obvious solution right in front of me. That night taught me just how easy it is to get caught off guard in the wilderness, even when you think you're prepared. From now on, I promised myself, no matter how foggy or tired I get, I'll remember the basics. I'll keep my gear organized, my priorities clear, and never underestimate how cold and exhaustion can mess with your head. We didn't bring back any stories of ghosts or monsters, just the raw, real fear of being cold, tired, and stuck in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a fading fire and a forgotten stove. It's a fear I'll never forget, and one that keeps me sharp every time I hit the trail again. The moment we pulled up to the house in Boise, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It was late afternoon, and the summer sun was dipping low behind the mountains. The house was big, way bigger than I expected for a simple weekend getaway. It sat quietly on a quiet street, surrounded by old pine trees that cast long shadows across the yard. The lawn was perfectly trimmed, and flowers lined the walkway leading to the front door. It looked like one of those places you see in magazines about cozy, peaceful homes in small-town America. My partner and I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. We needed a break from the city, from work, from everything. The plan was simple: rent a nice place, cook good food, maybe explore some local hiking trails, and just relax. We weren't expecting anything fancy, just a calm place to unwind. The photos online showed a spacious, clean, bright home with lots of windows and a cozy living room with a fireplace. Perfect. But as we got out of the car, I noticed something off right away. There was a quietness to the neighborhood that felt too still, like it was holding its breath. Not a car passed by, not a dog barked, not a single person was outside. The house itself looked well kept, but it didn't feel welcoming. The windows on the front looked dark, and the door had no visible doorbell. I reached out and knocked, but there was no answer. We had been told by the booking site to just let ourselves in and the host would contact us later. We let ourselves in, bags in hand. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cleaning products mixed with something earthy, like old wood and damp stone. The hallway was long and narrow, painted in a dull cream color with cheap carpet that muffled our footsteps. It was quieter inside than outside, somehow. The place had a strange kind of silence, like it was waiting for something. We wandered into the living room. It was bigger than expected, with a large leather couch, a big TV on the wall, and tall windows facing the backyard. Sunlight spilled in, but the room still felt cold and empty. There were a few small personal touches, a stack of magazines on the coffee table, a half-finished puzzle on the side table, but nothing that made it feel lived in or welcoming. No family photos, no clutter, no signs of real life. Then, I noticed the stairs leading down to the basement. Our reservation had clearly said we would have a large upstairs bedroom with a nice view, but when I checked the booking confirmation again on my phone, it mentioned a basement room. I shrugged and told myself maybe the photos were outdated or the host had made a mistake in the listing. We found a basement door at the end of the hallway, near the kitchen. It was heavy and old, painted the same dull cream color as the walls. When I opened it, a rush of colder air hit me, as if the basement had been closed up for a long time. The stairs creaked under our feet as we descended. The walls were bare concrete, and the only light came from a dim ceiling bulb that flickered occasionally. The room at the bottom was surprisingly spacious, maybe bigger than our apartment back home. It had one small window near the ceiling that looked out onto the backyard, but it was covered in dust and grime. The furniture was sparse: a large bed pushed against the far wall, a small wooden dresser, and a folding chair. The sheets looked clean but smelled faintly of mildew. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. We put down our bags and tried to shake off the weird feeling settling in. My partner lit a few candles to warm the space, and I opened the window a crack to let some fresh air in. Outside, the street was still silent. No cars, no footsteps, no signs of life. We decided to explore the rest of the house. Upstairs, we found a few locked doors, and the place was dusty in places, like it hadn't been used regularly. There was an odd smell in some rooms, something like damp fabric mixed with old wood smoke. It was clear someone had been living there recently, but no one was around now. That evening, we cooked dinner in the kitchen. The appliances were old but functional, and the cupboards had mismatched dishes and a few cans of food left behind. While washing up, I noticed a door at the back of the kitchen leading to a small room with a water heater and a dog crate inside. It was empty, but I remembered the listing didn't mention a dog. I asked my partner if they had seen anything about a pet in the reservation. They hadn't. The house felt more like a storage place than a vacation home. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from the host. The text was strange, short, almost clipped, and said, "You're in the wrong room. Basement isn't yours. Host knows. Dog they're not supposed to be. Contact me." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Who else was in the house? Why had we been put in the basement? I tried calling the host back, but there was no answer. My partner and I exchanged uneasy looks. Later that night, we tried to sleep, but the basement felt suffocating. The air was stale, and the silence was so thick it pressed against our ears. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, soft footsteps moving across the floor, right next to the bed. My eyes shot open. I sat up and looked around. Nothing. No one there. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, or maybe my imagination running wild. But then I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing right beside us. My partner was frozen too. Neither of us said a word. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but the basement window didn't let in much light. The beam cut through the darkness, but the room was empty. Still, the footsteps kept coming closer to the bed, then stopped right at the edge. I pulled the covers up over my head and whispered to my partner that we needed to get out. We packed our bags in a hurry, trying not to make any noise. The whole time, I felt eyes watching us from the shadows. The basement was no longer just cold, it felt hostile. We crept upstairs and out of the house without turning on any lights. The front door shut behind us with a heavy thud, and I swear I heard a faint rustling from the back rooms, like something or someone was moving inside. In the car, we sat in silence. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone watching us from the window. We didn't wait for the host to call back. We just left. As we drove away, the house disappeared into the dark behind us, but the feeling stayed. It was like the place had eyes that followed us, like the house itself was alive and aware of our presence. We didn't stop until we were miles away, out of the neighborhood and back on the busy highway. Looking back, it's clear we were not just assigned the wrong room. We had been given access to a part of the house we weren't meant to see. The host's message hinted at secrets we couldn't understand fully. And the presence in that basement, the footsteps, the cold watching feeling, was real but not supernatural. It was something human, something aware and waiting. We never went back, never contacted the host again, and never rented from that site for a house stay in Boise. What happened that night was a sharp reminder. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown, the mistakes we don't catch until it's too late, and the people we never meet who might be watching from just out of sight. I remember the first time I heard about that terrible tragedy in the Ural Mountains. 9 experienced hikers, strong, smart, well-prepared people, found dead under the most baffling and disturbing circumstances. The story stuck with me because it was real. No ghosts, no monsters. Just something out there, something so fierce and strange it took them all. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking in rough places, camping in wild country. So the idea that a group like that could die so badly, so mysteriously, in a place many of us would call home in the wild, hit me hard. I wanted to understand what happened, so I dug into the details. What I found chilled me. There were 9 hikers, all experienced. Some of them had done hundreds, maybe thousands of kilometers of hiking before, through tough terrain and bad weather. They had all the right gear, warm clothes, tents, food, navigation tools. They weren't amateurs. This wasn't their first cold night in the mountains. Their route was planned through the northern Urals, a rugged, remote region with harsh winters. It's a place where the weather can turn on you in minutes. The hikers set off in January, when the cold was biting deep, the wind sharp and unrelenting. The Ural Mountains are no joke in winter. Temperatures easily drop below minus 30 degrees Celsius, and storms can rage with little warning. Still, these 9 were confident. They had prepared. They had experience. After they failed to check in on time, search teams were sent out. What they found was horrifying. Their tent was ripped open from the inside. It looked like something desperate had torn through it, claws or fists maybe, but nothing in the area showed signs of large animals nearby. The tent poles were bent, fabric shredded, and inside were the bodies of the hikers. Some of them were missing eyes, others tongues. Many had crushed ribs, as if something had crushed or slammed into them with incredible force. They were nearly naked, despite the freezing temperatures. Their clothes were scattered nearby, half frozen in the snow. None of it made sense. The official Soviet investigation concluded the cause was some compelling natural force, but no one ever explained how or why that force would do what it did. The hikers were too experienced to panic like that and rip their clothes off in freezing weather. Their injuries were too brutal and strange for normal animal attacks or avalanches. It didn't sit right with me. I started to picture the moments before they died. What could make 9 strong people tear apart their own tent, strip off their clothes in the cold, and suffer such strange injuries? Something that wasn't just the cold, or a bear, or a landslide. Something no one could name. I kept thinking about the weather that night. I read old reports and survivor stories from similar areas. When temperatures drop fast and the wind blows at crazy speeds, the cold can confuse your mind and body. Hypothermia is a silent killer. It makes your brain shut down logic, makes you take off your clothes, think you're too hot when you're freezing. But it doesn't explain the crushed ribs or missing eyes and tongues. Not by itself. The area they camped in was a high clearing, exposed to the wind. I imagined a storm coming in fast. Maybe the wind howled like a wild animal, pushing against the tent walls, shaking everything. If the storm was bad enough, maybe the hikers were trying to escape something inside the tent. Maybe they panicked, ripped the tent open from the inside, trying to get out into the blizzard. But even then, how would their bodies end up like that? Crushed ribs could come from falling or being hit by debris, but nothing else around suggested a rock slide or tree fall. And the missing eyes and tongues? That's something else entirely. I remembered reading that scavengers like birds or small animals sometimes come after people die, especially if the bodies are exposed. In the cold, some tissue can freeze and be ripped away. But in these cases, the wounds looked too clean and strange for scavengers. It was almost like their faces had been attacked while they were alive, but no animal could have done it with such precision. Their clothing was scattered, but some was found in strange places, some buried in snow, some wrapped around branches. The cold made movement harder, but somehow they moved around a lot. That suggested panic, maybe confusion. I thought about what I've seen during bad storms on the trail. When the wind and cold reach a certain point, they become almost unbearable. Your body feels numb, your mind clouds over. I've had friends suffer bad hypothermia, and in their last moments before going unconscious, they do crazy things. Rip off gloves, take off layers, try to move when they should stay still. I've never seen anything close to what happened to those hikers, though. Then I considered the possibility of some kind of weather phenomenon beyond just cold and wind. Something like a microburst or intense wind vortex that can slam through a small area with unbelievable force, ripping tents, breaking ribs, tossing people around like rag dolls. If a sudden gust like that hit the campsite, it could explain the crushed ribs and torn tent. If the storm forced them to abandon the tent, they could have stripped off wet clothes to avoid freezing to death while wet, which sometimes happens in panic. But that still doesn't explain everything. The missing tongues and eyes? It remains the darkest part of the mystery. What if they suffered from severe frostbite that caused tissue to die and be lost before discovery? But the bodies were found soon enough that advanced frostbite wouldn't explain missing parts so precisely. Another idea I thought about was the effect of rapid decompression or intense pressure changes. The mountains sometimes trap strange atmospheric conditions. A sudden drop in pressure could cause internal injuries, but no one has ever recorded such a thing killing hikers like that. As I tried to piece this puzzle together, I began to understand the real horror wasn't just the cold or the storm. It was how fragile humans are in the face of nature's raw power. These hikers prepared for a cold trip, but nature has its own rules. Rules that can overwhelm even the strongest, most experienced people. They were caught by a storm unlike anything they expected. The wind tore through their tent, crushing them against the poles and fabric. In a desperate attempt to survive, their minds turned against them. Confused, numb, disoriented, they stripped off clothes, trying to shed wet layers, but the cold was too much. Some injuries came from falling debris or from being slammed into the hard ground or nearby rocks by the storm's power. The eyes and tongues? Maybe those injuries were caused by the violent shaking, perhaps even by the frostbite damaging soft tissue rapidly, and then being broken off during the storm or after death by the movement of the bodies. Scavengers might have taken some tissue too, but the cold kept most animals away for a time. The worst part is how helpless they were, how little control humans have when nature turns deadly fast. It wasn't ghosts, monsters, or any fairy tale horror. It was the mountain, the cold, the storm, the pressure crushing their bodies and minds. When I think about it now, the real story isn't about some strange force. It's about how brutal and indifferent the wild can be. No warnings, no mercy. 9 hikers, strong, smart, prepared, brought down by a combination of weather, cold, and maybe a violent wind no one could predict. It's a grim reminder for anyone who ventures out there. Respect the mountains, respect the weather, and know that sometimes even your best preparation isn't enough. The wild doesn't care who you are. It just is. And sometimes that's all it takes to break you. Years later, I stood at the edge of a similar mountain clearing, feeling the wind whipping my face, snow crunching under my boots. I could almost hear the echoes of that terrible night in the Ural Mountains. I thought about those 9 hikers, and I realized this. There's a raw power out here, cold and silent, that no human can fight. The truth of what happened to them isn't some dark secret. It's the truth of the wild itself. A reminder that nature is not safe, not kind, and it's always ready to remind us of our place. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. It was a small cabin tucked deep in the woods, the kind of place that looked perfect for a quiet weekend away from the city noise. The pictures showed a cozy space, rough wooden beams, a stone fireplace, simple but warm furniture. It wasn't far from the nearest town, but still private enough to feel isolated. I thought it would be a good spot to write, relax, and disconnect for a couple days. When I arrived, the sun was just setting, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. The gravel driveway was long and narrow, flanked by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the wind. I parked the car near the cabin and grabbed my bags. The only sound around me was the crunch of the gravel under my boots and the distant call of a bird settling in for the night. The cabin was just as the photos promised, simple but comfortable. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and something like pine resin. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with an odd mix of novels, travel guides, and old magazines. There was a small kitchen with basic appliances, a table with a few mismatched chairs, and a soft armchair by the fireplace. I set my things down, lit a fire, and settled in. That first night, everything felt calm and peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, listened to some music, and read for a while before falling asleep. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that makes you notice every little creak and snap of wood. Around midnight, I woke up because the wind picked up outside. It rattled the windows and made the trees groan. I lay there listening, trying to focus on the rhythm of the wind instead of the small noises the cabin made. After a while, I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I explored the surrounding woods. The trail started just behind the cabin, winding through dense trees, crossing over small streams and moss-covered rocks. The air was cool and damp, filled with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The quiet was almost total. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. I found it odd, but didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just the time of day. Back at the cabin, I worked on my writing for several hours. The fireplace crackled quietly, and the soft light from a lamp gave the room a warm glow. I felt relaxed, almost too relaxed, like the cabin was wrapping me up in its stillness. Outside, the wind had died down and the woods were calm again. Late that afternoon, I decided to check the cabin's perimeter. I wanted to make sure I knew the area around me in case I wanted to go for another walk. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and some patches were muddy from earlier rain. I walked around the back of the cabin and noticed something strange. The ground looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. At first, I thought maybe an animal had been at it, but the marks looked too neat. It was like a shallow hole had been started, then abandoned. I couldn't see anything inside the hole. It was too dark and narrow. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the previous guest had tried to bury something or fix something underground. I didn't want to think too much about it. That night, the silence felt different. The usual creaks and groans were quieter, but there were other sounds. Faint, distant noises, like footsteps on dry leaves or a branch snapping far away. Every time I heard one, I froze and listened hard. The noises stopped when I stayed still, but then they would start again somewhere else. It wasn't loud or close, but it was constant. I tried to ignore it, but sleep was difficult. The cabin felt smaller somehow, like it was closing in. When I finally fell asleep, it was with the lights on and the door locked tight. The next morning, I woke early and decided to leave the cabin for a while. I needed to clear my head. I packed a small bag, locked up, and walked down the driveway toward the town. The air felt heavy, and even in the daylight, the woods seemed darker than usual. At the town's small grocery store, I ran into a woman who worked at the tourist information center. I asked her about the cabin and the area. She hesitated before telling me that the land the cabin sat on used to belong to a farmer who disappeared years ago. They never found him, and after a while, the farm was sold off and divided. The cabin was built later on part of the property. Something about what she said didn't sit right with me, but I thanked her and left. On the way back, I stopped at a small hardware store and bought some supplies, a shovel, extra batteries for my flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I figured if I was going to stay a bit longer, I should be prepared. Back at the cabin, I went straight to the spot where I saw the disturbed ground. The hole looked the same, but this time I took the shovel and carefully dug around it. The earth was soft and easy to move, and soon I uncovered the edge of a metal box, rusted and covered in dirt. I hesitated, but pulled it out. The box was old, about the size of a shoebox, with a latch that was stuck tight. After some effort, I managed to pry it open. Inside, there were old papers, some faded photographs, and a small notebook. The papers were farm records and letters, mostly about crops and livestock. The photographs showed a family, a man, a woman, and a few children standing in front of an old farmhouse. The man looked stern, the kind of person who worked hard and didn't waste time. The notebook was a journal. The handwriting was neat, but hurried in places. I read through it slowly. The man had written about strange things happening on the farm. Tools going missing, livestock found injured, noises in the night. He seemed to suspect someone was sneaking onto the property. The entries grew more anxious over time, mentioning figures seen in the woods and the feeling of being watched. The last entry was different. It was dated almost a year before the farmer disappeared. He wrote about someone coming to his door late at night, asking for help. He didn't say who, but he described the visitor as desperate and dangerous. The entry ended abruptly, with the man saying he planned to confront whoever was troubling the farm the next day. I closed the notebook slowly, feeling a chill even though the room was warm. The silence around me seemed to press in tighter. The noises from the previous night echoed in my mind. That night, I stayed inside, locking all the doors and windows. I sat by the fire, reading the journal again, trying to understand what had happened here. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the cabin like before. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, not outside, but just beyond the thin walls. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I held my breath, heart pounding, but I told myself it was probably an animal or the wind moving something. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a long minute, there was only silence. Then came a sharp knock on the door. I didn't move. The knocking continued, slow, steady, like someone was testing to see if I was home. My fingers tightened around the book I was holding. After a while, the knocking stopped. I didn't dare look outside. The night felt endless. In the morning, I checked the door and the windows. Everything was locked and intact, but the front door had a fresh scratch near the handle, like someone had tried to force it open. I packed my bags immediately and left. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin through the rearview mirror. The sun was rising, casting long shadows between the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me go. I didn't look back again. The experience stayed with me. The silence, the footsteps, the hidden box with its story of fear and disappearance. It wasn't supernatural, just people, fear, and the way old wounds don't always heal. The cabin was quiet now, but I knew it kept the memory of those who had lived and struggled there. And sometimes, those memories reach out in ways you can't ignore. I never stayed in a place like that again, but I'm glad I found the journal. It gave me the truth, and that was enough. The woods don't hide ghosts, but they hold real stories, sometimes darker than any ghost story you can imagine. I arrived just before dusk. The Airbnb was supposed to be a quiet place to rest, away from the noise and stress of the city. I've been working long hours, feeling burnout, and needed a break. When I booked it, the pictures looked perfect. A small cabin on the edge of a forest, with tall trees all around, and a little porch where I could sit with a cup of coffee in the morning. The host was polite and quick with messages, which made me feel more comfortable going there alone. The drive to the rental was longer than I expected. The GPS led me down a narrow, winding road, with trees pressing in on both sides like a wall. The sun was low, turning the sky pink and orange. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, but also how isolated. There were no other cars, no houses in sight, and the radio in my car only caught static. I felt a small shiver, not from cold, but from the silence. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the cabin was exactly like the pictures, simple wooden, with a sloped roof and a chimney that promised a fireplace inside. I parked, grabbed my bags, and unlocked the door with the code the host had sent me. The inside smelled faintly of wood and cleaning spray. It was cozy, with a small living room, a kitchen area, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There were no other people around, just me and the quiet of the forest outside. I unpacked quickly, wanting to get settled before it got too dark. I made myself some dinner using the small stove and sat by the window, watching the last light fade through the trees. The silence was deep. No cars, no dogs barking, not even birds singing. It felt almost too quiet, but I told myself that was what I wanted, the chance to get away and hear nothing but my own thoughts. After dinner, I lit a fire in the small fireplace. The flames flickered and cast shadows on the wooden walls. I sat there with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Outside, the darkness was thick. The trees looked like tall black shapes. The only sound was the crackling fire in my own breathing. Around 10, I decided to get ready for bed. The bedroom was small but warm, with thick curtains over the window. I brushed my teeth, turned off the lights, and climbed under the covers. The silence pressed against me. It was so quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the wooden house settling. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft knock. Not at the door, but at the window beside the bed. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Another knock, slow and deliberate. I held my breath and strained to see through the curtains, but the glass was fog from the heat inside. The knocking stopped. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a branch hitting the window in the wind. But there was no wind. The trees stood still. The silence outside was total. I got up carefully and pulled the curtain aside. The forest was black, the trees just shapes in the darkness. Nothing was there. I checked the window lock. It was secure. I tried to calm down, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. Back in bed, I waited, eyes wide open. Minutes passed. No more knocking. I began to relax and finally fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Not outside, but inside the cabin. Soft, slow steps on the wooden floor. I froze under the covers, heart pounding. The footsteps moved from a living room toward the kitchen, slow and steady. I stayed quiet, trying to think. Who could it be? The host had made it clear I was the only guest. I didn't hear a door opening or closing, no creak from the front door. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. I could hear the wood floor creak under the weight. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, moving back toward the living room. Then nothing. I lay there, too scared to move, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling. I kept listening for sounds, but the cabin was silent again. I got up slowly and checked every door and window. All were locked and secure. The front door had no signs of being opened. It was like whoever or whatever had walked around inside the cabin without touching the doors. I went to the kitchen and poured myself some coffee. My hands shook as I held the cup. I tried to think clearly. Maybe the host had forgotten to mention something, like a caretaker or someone who lived nearby. But there was no cell signal to call anyone, no way to contact help. The nearest town was miles away. I decided to pack up and leave as soon as possible. But before I could finish, I heard it again, this time outside the cabin. A slow, soft thud, thud, thud on the wooden porch. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the door, just a crack. The porch was empty. No footprints in the fresh dirt leading up to the steps. I stepped outside and shone the light into the trees. Nothing moved. The silence was total. I closed the door and locked it behind me. I sat down on the porch steps, trying to calm myself. The sun was rising now, and the forest looked less frightening in the daylight. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I spent the day trying to ignore everything. I cleaned the cabin, made a plan to leave, and checked the GPS for the fastest route back to the main road. But the whole time, I kept hearing strange noises, branches snapping far away, the sound of footsteps crunching in the leaves. Every time I looked out the window, I saw nothing but trees. That night, I stayed up until dawn. I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window with the flashlight in my hand, watching the darkness. I didn't hear any knocking or footsteps inside the cabin, but every little noise outside made my heart race. The next morning, I was packed and ready to leave. I double-checked the locks, grabbed my bags, and stepped outside. As I walked to my car, I noticed something strange. In the dirt near the porch steps were footprints, small like a person walking carefully. They weren't there when I arrived. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the forest. I felt cold. Whoever had been here was still close. I locked the door one last time, got in my car, and started the engine. As I drove down the narrow road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway and found a gas station with a phone. I called the host and told them I was leaving early because I felt unsafe. They apologized and said no one else was supposed to be on the property and they would check with the neighbors. After that, I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone had been watching me or sneaking around the cabin at night. I just wanted to get home. Later, when I told a friend about it, they said maybe someone used the cabin to hide or squat and didn't want to be seen. That made sense. The forest was thick, the road was hidden, and it was easy for someone to sneak in without being noticed. I realized how important it is to trust your gut. Even if everything looks fine, sometimes being alone in a place like that can be dangerous. Now, I always double-check the reviews and talk to the host before booking a place. And I never stay somewhere alone if I feel uneasy. That trip taught me something simple but important. Safety comes first, and sometimes the scariest things don't come from ghosts or stories. They come from real people and real situations hidden in the quiet dark. I moved into the basement apartment of an old house in eastern Maine during the early fall. The place was cheap and simple, just what I needed while I worked a temporary job nearby. It wasn't fancy, low ceilings, a tiny kitchen, a little living room with a sagging couch, and one bedroom down a narrow hallway. The basement felt cold and dark compared to the rest of the house, but I told myself that was normal for basements. I wasn't planning to stay long anyway, just a couple of months. The house itself was old, probably built around the early 1900s. The wood floors creaked, the walls were thin, and the paint peeled in places. The landlord said the basement apartment had its own separate entrance and was private, but there was one shared door inside the house that connected the upstairs to the basement. The landlord said he never went down there unless he had to fix something, which made me feel better. At first, everything seemed normal. I settled in, unpacked a few boxes, and tried to get comfortable. The basement was dim, with only a few small windows near the ceiling that let in faint light. It had a damp smell, but I ran a space heater and kept the windows open for a bit to air it out. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in some spots, and the hallway leading from the front door of the apartment to the bedroom was narrow and long. It was down that hallway where I first noticed something odd. At the very end of the hallway, opposite my bedroom door, there was another door. The door was unusual because instead of being solid like the others, it looked like a large mirror. A big rectangle that covered almost the entire door, reflecting the dim basement hallway back at me. It was clean and smooth and looked like a mirror at first glance, but the frame around it was old, weathered, and a little chipped. I didn't give it much thought at first. I assumed it was some kind of closet or maybe an old utility room. But the door never seemed to open, and the landlord had never mentioned any extra rooms down there. A few days in, I got curious. I decided to check it out more closely when no one else was around. I walked down the hallway slowly, my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet basement. The space heater hummed behind me, making the air warm and dry. I reached the mirror door and stood in front of it, staring at my own reflection. I noticed something strange. The mirror didn't quite reflect the hallway behind me perfectly. It seemed off. I pressed my hand against the glass-like surface. It didn't feel like regular glass. It was colder than I expected and felt a little thicker. I tried knocking lightly with my knuckles, expecting a hollow sound like a closet door, but it sounded solid and dense like a wall. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, angling the light at different spots on the door. I tried to see if there was a keyhole, a handle, or any sign that it could open. Nothing. The door was perfectly flat, seamless, and unbreakable looking. Then, I noticed a tiny crack in the wood frame near the top. It was just a small chip in the paint, but through it I caught a glimpse of a dark space behind the door. Something wasn't right. The next night, I decided to try something. I turned off all the lights in the basement apartment and sat quietly in the living room. The only light came from the street lamp outside the small basement window, faint but steady. I walked slowly down the hallway, toward the mirrored door again, my heart beating a little faster. I pressed my eye against the surface carefully. The door wasn't just a mirror, it was a one-way mirror. Behind it was a dark room, and through the glass, I could see shadows moving faintly. I couldn't make out any shapes clearly, but I knew someone was on the other side watching me. That realization hit me like a cold wave. I stepped back quickly, my breath shallow. Who would have a one-way mirror in the basement of a rental apartment? Who was watching and why? I felt exposed, like someone was spying on me constantly without my knowledge. The basement suddenly felt suffocating. My sense of safety shattered. For the rest of that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening carefully to every sound. Every creak of the old house made me jump. I imagined someone peering at me from behind that mirror, watching my every move while I was supposed to be alone. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought heavy-duty wooden planks and some nails. I spent hours barring up that door. I hammered the boards across the frame, blocking the mirror completely. I didn't want to look at it anymore, and I didn't want anyone watching me. After that, I tried to get on with my days, but the unease lingered. Every time I walked down the hallway, I felt the weight of the hidden room behind the wall. I realized I had no idea what was in that room, or how long it had been there, or why. One evening, I was sitting on the couch when I heard soft footsteps above me, like someone walking slowly back and forth. I reminded myself the house was old, the floors creaked, and the landlord or his family might be upstairs. But then I heard a sound like a key turning in a lock, soft, deliberate. I remembered the door upstairs that connected to the basement. Was someone coming down? Were they checking on the basement? Had they known about the mirror all along? I locked my apartment door from the inside and kept the planks nailed across the mirror door. I started double-checking every lock and window every night before bed. I didn't tell anyone about the mirror, not even the landlord, because I was afraid no one would believe me or that it would cause trouble. Days passed with no incidents, but my paranoia grew. I felt trapped in my own apartment, like I was being watched even when I thought I was alone. One afternoon, I decided to check the outside entrance to the basement apartment. The door was solid and locked tight. I noticed that the old house had thick walls and a strange layout, rooms and passages that didn't quite make sense. I peeked through a cracked window near the stairs and saw a small, dark crawl space behind the basement walls. I realized that the room behind the mirror door was probably this crawl space or a hidden utility room. But the fact it had a one-way mirror was terrifying. Someone had gone out of their way to build it, to be able to watch the basement apartment without being seen. I wondered if the landlord knew. Maybe it was a previous owner or a squatter. Or maybe it was part of some strange surveillance setup. I didn't stay much longer after that. I packed up and moved out the next week. The moment I left, the feeling of being watched disappeared. Looking back, I still don't know who was behind that mirror or how long they had been watching. I never found any cameras or devices, but the mirror itself was proof enough. That basement apartment taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or legends. They're the real people who invade your privacy and make you feel unsafe in your own home. I've never stayed anywhere without checking every door, every window, every dark corner since then. And I never want to be caught off guard like that again. I still remember the cold that morning we found the Montego. I say we, but it was really just me and a guy from the county named Ron. He worked roads, and I was with search and rescue at the time. Snow had started to melt a little early that spring, and the Forest Service was opening up some of the gates off the mountain roads. The Montego sat right where the snowplow couldn't reach, a pale green 1969 Mercury, sticking out like a sore thumb against the gray slush and tall trees. Empty, locked, and quiet. I could tell right away it didn't belong there. The men had gone missing in February. 5 of them, all from Yuba City, all with what they called mild intellectual disabilities. Not what folks used to say back in the day, words we've all learned not to use, but they had trouble with things. Keeping jobs, figuring out plans, remembering stuff. But they weren't helpless. They all lived with their families, worked at places like the Vocational Rehab Center, played basketball together. Good guys. They had gone to see a college game in Chico, and that was the last anyone saw them. The car was 70 miles east of Chico, way off their route home, deep in the Plumas National Forest, up an unpaved road that even locals didn't use in winter. When we first saw it, we figured they might have gotten lost in a storm, panicked, maybe tried to walk out. Happens more than you'd think. But when we popped the trunk and found Neatly folded maps, candy wrappers, and some fast food bags, I got that tight feeling in my stomach that something wasn't right. The keys weren't in the ignition. The car was unlocked. No damage to it. It had gas, too. Later, mechanics said it would have started right up. So why walk away from it? We searched for weeks. Dogs, choppers, volunteers. The snow didn't help. That whole area is rough country. Thick woods, steep canyons, and barely any cell service even now. After a month, most of us knew we wouldn't find them alive. That's the thing you don't say out loud, but you feel it in your bones. Then in June, a group of motorcyclists took a wrong turn on a trail and found the first body. It was about 20 miles from where the car had been, up a service road, tucked into the forest like something hidden on purpose. He was lying on his back, shoes gone, covered in bits of snow and pine needles. His body was already partly decomposed. The wildlife had gotten to him. We found the other 3 about a quarter mile farther. 2 had died together under a tree, curled up like they were trying to stay warm. The third was maybe 50 feet away, face down in the brush. One of them had a flashlight still clutched in his hand. I don't think they ever found batteries in it. Maybe they thought it would work when it got dark. The fourth man, Ted, was different. We didn't find him in the woods. We found him in a trailer, in a summer cabin closed up for the season. The cabin belonged to the Forest Service, just a basic thing, single story, with bunk beds and a stock pantry. There was plenty of food inside, canned beans, dehydrated meals, even milk powder. There was wood for the stove, extra blankets, but he never touched any of it. He had taken off his shoes and tucked himself in a bed like he was trying to sleep off a fever. The coroner said he died of starvation. He had lost almost half his body weight. They figured he lived 2 to 3 months after the others. And in all that time, he never lit a fire, never opened a single can. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of violence. But the details bothered me. The trailer was locked from the inside. A window had been broken, and that's how we think he got in, but he didn't even try to seal it up. There were matches on the counter, blankets on the shelves. He just never used them. Then there was the 5th man, Gary. He was never found. Not a single trace. No clothing, no bones, no signs he'd been in the cabin or with the others when they died. And that raised more questions than it answered, because Gary was the highest functioning of the group. He could drive, use a bank account, follow a map. Some people thought maybe he snapped and left them. Some thought he led them up there. His own family never believed that. They said he hated the cold, hated camping, and was afraid of the dark. I remember the drive up to the cabin the day we found Ted. The road was barely passable even in summer. Branches scratched the side of the truck, and at one point we had to get out and move a fallen log. The air was still and heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. When we walked into the cabin, it smelled of old wood and something sour. Ted's body was in the back room, curled under the covers. His feet were drawn up like he'd been cold for a long time. The mattress was soaked through, and the blanket was pulled up to his chin. The oddest thing? The light bulb in the cabin worked. Someone had flipped it on and off. The generator outside had fuel in it, but it was never started. We kept coming back to that question. Why go up that road? There were no signs they had been chased. No signs they tried to call for help. In fact, one of the men had a working watch, and another had a pack of neatly folded clothes like they were planning to change. But then they just wandered off into the woods. For a long time, I figured we'd never know. People talked about cults, about hitchhikers, even about mountain men who didn't want strangers around. But it wasn't until years later, when I was long out of the field, that I learned something that made it all click for me. I ran into a guy at a veterans meeting in Grass Valley. He was older, grizzled, walked with a limp. We got to talking over coffee, and I mentioned the case like I always did when I met folks from that part of the state. His eyes narrowed, and he said he remembered that winter. He'd been living in a cabin not too far from there. Said he'd seen something strange around the time those men vanished. He didn't want to go on record, but he said he'd been walking a logging trail when he saw a group of 5 men walking single file down the middle of the track. One of them, the one in the lead, was talking loud, almost yelling. He couldn't make out the words, but the man had something in his hand. Maybe a map, maybe just paper. He said the others followed close behind, heads down, looking nervous. He didn't approach them, didn't wave. He just watched. said something about the scene gave him a bad feeling. Later, when the snow came in, he tried to hike out and ended up snowed in for weeks. When he finally got to a radio, he heard about the missing men. He was sure the man leading them was Gary. Now, this could have been a mistake. It was years ago, and people misremember things. But it lined up with what we thought. They weren't chased. They weren't lost. Not at first. Someone led them up there. I started piecing things together. The car was found parked carefully, not crashed. The maps were folded. They weren't in a panic when they stopped. Someone thought they had a reason to be there. Then I remembered something else. About a year before this all happened, Gary had told a coworker about a plan to take his friends up into the mountains. Said he wanted to start fresh, maybe live off the land. The guy he told thought it was a joke, but maybe Gary didn't. Maybe he got it in his head that he could take care of them, that they could be free up there. No more people looking at them weird, no more rules or rehab, just the woods. But they weren't prepared. They had fast food and light jackets. When the weather turned, they panicked. Maybe one or two tried to walk out and died from exposure. The others followed. Gary might have gone for help. Or maybe he ran, ashamed or scared. Or maybe he died out there, in some ravine we never thought to look. Ted, the last one, found shelter. But by then he must have been too far gone. Confused, starving, maybe sick. He lay down to rest and never got back up. I think about it every winter when the snow piles up and the back roads disappear. How easy it is to vanish out there. People think it takes something dark, murder, ghosts, monsters. But the truth is quieter. Just one bad decision, one wrong turn, one person with a plan that didn't make sense to anyone else. And 5 lives gone just like that. We never found Gary. But sometimes when I'm driving the forest roads alone, I catch myself looking out into the trees, wondering if he's still out there, buried under moss and leaves. Or maybe he made it out and never looked back. Maybe he's just a name now, a missing person on an old flyer. But I don't think so. I think the mountains kept him, same as they kept the others. Not out of cruelty, just indifference. The forest doesn't care who you are or why you came. It's just there, cold, quiet, and waiting. I grew up hearing about June and Jennifer Gibbons, the twins who lived in a quiet corner of Wales but seemed to carry a storm inside them. I never met them, but their story followed me for years. It wasn't the kind of story that had ghosts or magic. It was something far darker, rooted in real life. A story about 2 girls so tightly bound to each other that they created a world no one else could enter. Their lives were strange, full of silence and secrets. And the end of their story was as haunting as anything you might imagine, but with no ghosts involved. June and Jennifer were identical twins, born at the same time, looking exactly alike down to the smallest detail. But what set them apart from everyone else wasn't just their looks. It was the strange way they refused to speak to anyone outside their pair. Their world was closed off. They spoke only to each other, using a language no one else understood. The silence they held towards the rest of the world was deafening. They didn't just ignore people. They shut them out completely. In school, teachers tried everything. They would call on June or Jennifer, but only silence or whispered words came back. When asked to speak to others, they stayed silent or mumbled to each other in that secret language. Classmates felt uncomfortable, and the twins became more and more isolated. Some people thought they were shy, others thought they were rude or strange. But the truth was much more complicated. June and Jennifer weren't just shy. They had created a private universe, a shared world of stories and ideas, where only they could live. Inside their secret world, the twins wrote stories. But these were no ordinary stories. They were dark, twisted, and disturbing. They made journals filled with strange tales about violence, betrayal, and pain. Things no child should be writing about. They used their writing like a mirror for their own feelings, a way to understand the silence they had wrapped themselves in. Their notebooks were hidden away, never meant for anyone else to see. The stories were like pieces of a puzzle, each revealing a bit more of their inner world. But no one outside ever really understood what was happening. As the years went by, their silence didn't break. In fact, it grew thicker. Their parents became desperate. Doctors and therapists came and went, trying to find a way to reach the girls. But June and Jennifer clung to each other like nothing else mattered. They never spoke to anyone else, and slowly, the outside world gave up trying to break through. The twins were both trapped and safe inside their shared silence. But as they grew older, something dark began to take shape between them. There was a strange pact they made, one that tied their lives together in a way no one could understand. They promised that one of them would have to die for the other to live a normal life. It wasn't just a fantasy. It was a real, heavy promise made out of desperation and pain. They felt so trapped by each other that the only way forward was for one to disappear. Jennifer was the one who died. The circumstances around her death were unclear and mysterious. She was sent to a psychiatric hospital in London, Broadmoor, which was known for holding people who were deeply troubled or dangerous. There, Jennifer's health began to fail, and in 1993, she died. The official cause was said to be acute myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart, but many believed it was more complicated. Some thought the death was connected to the strange life the twins had lived. Others whispered about neglect or something darker. The truth remains murky, and no one ever fully explained what happened inside those hospital walls. June survived. She left behind the silence, the secret language, and the strange bond with her sister. She slowly learned to live in the world again, and in the years after Jennifer's death, June started to live what could be called a normal life. She spoke more, made new friends, and even built a career. But the shadow of her sister's death stayed with her, a quiet reminder of the life they once shared and the terrible price it cost. The story of June and Jennifer is often told as a tragic mystery, but it's also a very human one. It shows how pain and isolation can twist the lives of even the closest people, and how sometimes silence speaks louder than words. It's not a story of ghosts or magic, but of two real girls who live in a world too dark for most to understand. When I first heard about the twins, I was just a kid curious about strange stories, but as I dug deeper, I found something far more unsettling than I expected. I learned how June and Jennifer's childhood was full of loneliness. They didn't have friends, and their parents struggled to connect with them. The twins spoke only to each other, in whispers that no one else could follow. They built a strange bubble where nothing from the outside world mattered. Their school years were especially tough. Teachers tried to reach them, but the twins responded with silence. They refused to participate in class discussions or join games. Other kids avoided them, not out of cruelty, but confusion and fear. June and Jennifer seemed to live in a different reality, one that others couldn't enter. Even their parents, though they loved them, didn't know how to reach through that silence. In the rare moments when they did speak, it was always to each other. They developed a language that was almost impossible to understand, made up of words, sounds, and gestures that only they knew. It was like they were creating their own secret code, a way to keep the world out. Their isolation was total. Their notebooks revealed something chilling. Inside those pages were stories filled with dark themes, stories of pain, fear, and violence. The twins used these writings to express what they couldn't say out loud. Some of their tales were terrifying, full of characters trapped in situations as hopeless as their own. The stories weren't just fiction. They were windows into the twins' minds, reflecting the struggle inside. As they got older, June and Jennifer's bond became something that scared people. They were so dependent on each other that they seemed unable to live apart. Yet that closeness became a prison. The idea of one dying for the other wasn't a childish fantasy. It was a desperate plan. They both believed that if one of them could disappear, the other could be free to live a normal life. The idea was terrifying, but also strangely logical to them. They were stuck in a place of silence and secrecy, unable to break free, and the only way forward was through sacrifice. Jennifer's death, years later, was the tragic result of this pact. The hospital where she was sent was a dark place for anyone, especially someone as fragile as Jennifer. The official story was medical, but no one really knew what went on in those lonely hospital halls. After Jennifer died, June's life changed. She began to find her voice. Slowly, she stepped back into the world, learning to live without the silence that had ruled her life. It wasn't easy. The memories and the bond she had lost stayed with her, but she managed to build a new life, one where she could speak to others, make connections, and find some peace. Her survival wasn't just about escaping her sister's shadow. It was about hope. June's story shows that even after deep darkness, there can be light. Life doesn't have to end in silence or despair. There's a way forward, even when it feels impossible. Their story remains a reminder of how complex the human mind is, how isolation can grow into something dangerous, and how sometimes the most frightening things aren't supernatural, but real and close to home. June and Jennifer's lives were full of pain, but June's survival proves that healing is possible. Their story is tragic, but it is also a story of hope and the power to change. I think about their story often because it feels real to ignore. Two people so close they became one, and one had to disappear for the other to survive. No magic, no ghosts, just the dark weight of loneliness and the desperate hope for freedom. June lives on. She found her way out, and that's the part one want to remember. The part that says no matter how deep the silence, no matter how dark the world seems, there's always a chance to find light again. I booked the house online without much thought. The funeral was going to be hard enough without the added stress of where to stay. The house looked normal, simple really, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Clean lawn, tidy flower beds, nothing out of place. I thought it'd be a good spot to keep things low-key, just a place to sleep and get ready for the service. When I arrived, the street was quiet, mostly neat little homes lined up one after another. The kind of place where everyone knows each other but keeps to themselves. I pulled up to the driveway and saw the house right away. It was a two-story with white siding and dark green shutters, a small porch with a couple of chairs. The front yard was freshly mowed and the windows were clean. The air smelled faintly of pine and something else, like freshly baked bread, or maybe the faint scent of air freshener. I unlocked the front door with the code the host had sent me and stepped inside. The house was just as clean as the photos showed. The floors were polished wood, and the furniture was simple but comfortable. The living room had a couch and a few armchairs arranged around a coffee table. The kitchen was bright, with sunlight spilling through the windows onto the counters. Everything looked cared for, almost too perfect. I set my bags down and started to look around. I was tired, drained from the trip, so I thought I'd just freshen up and lie down for a bit before the service tomorrow. But then, something caught my eye on the wall in the hallway. A cluster of framed photographs hung neatly in a row. I stopped and looked closer. At first, I thought it was just a regular family. Smiling faces, birthday parties, holidays, dog playing in the yard. But then my heart skipped. It was the same family as mine. The dad in the pictures had the exact same build, the same rough hands, the same smile my father had. The brother looked just like my older brother, even down to the way he laughed in those pictures. And the dog, our old golden retriever from childhood, was there too, chasing a ball in one photo, lying by the fireplace in another. I stared at the photos longer than I should have. My own face wasn't in any of them. That part felt wrong. How could this be the same family if I wasn't there? The photos looked like they were taken over many years. There were pictures of kids growing up, but not me. I know every family photo we ever had. My parents never left me out. My face should be in some of these pictures, but there was nothing. My stomach tightened. I pulled out my phone and found the host number. I called. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice finally answered, stammered something I didn't catch, and then the call cut off. I tried calling again. This time, no answer, just a busy tone. I left a message, but there was no reply. That night, I tried to sleep but kept thinking about the photos. How was it possible for this family to look exactly like mine, but not include me? The house was quiet, too quiet. I thought maybe I was just tired, maybe overthinking things. I closed my eyes and tried to push the thoughts away. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I woke up because the room felt colder than before. I opened my eyes slowly and right there on the nightstand was a new framed photo. I didn't recognize it at first, but then I saw it clearly. It was a picture of me sleeping in this very bed. The picture was recent. My face was peaceful, eyes closed, everything just as I was now. My heart pounded. I sat up quickly, almost knocking the frame over. I grabbed the photo and looked at it closely. It was definitely me. The angle was exactly as if someone was standing next to the bed taking the picture. I looked around the room, but no one was there. The door was shut tight and the windows were locked. I wanted to scream or call someone, but I stayed silent, afraid of what might happen if I made a noise. The logical part of me was screaming that this was impossible. How did someone get into the house without me knowing? How had they taken this photo without waking me up? Why would someone want to scare me like this? I put the photo down and sat on the edge of the bed. I tried to think about what to do next. The first thing was clear. I couldn't stay in this house another night. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but it was dark, and I didn't want to carry my bags through the quiet house in the middle of the night. Instead, I grabbed my phone and checked the front door lock. It was secure, no sign of forced entry. I walked around the house, checking every door and window again. Everything was locked and seemed normal. No footprints in the yard, no broken locks, no sign someone had been inside except for the photo. That was the only thing that didn't make sense. I sat back down on the bed, clutching the photo in my hands. I tried to calm down, telling myself maybe the photo had been there earlier, and I just didn't notice it. But no, I was sure I would have seen it. I checked the nightstand several times before going to bed. I stared at the picture until dawn. When the first light came through the window, I carefully put the photo in my bag and locked the bedroom door. I didn't want to leave it behind. I decided I'd call the police once I got back into town. Morning came, and the neighborhood woke up. People started mowing lawns, kids riding bikes, the usual suburban sounds. I packed quickly, my hands trembling a bit, and left the house without looking back. I still didn't understand what happened or why the photos of my family were on the walls, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Later that day, I drove to the funeral, trying to shake off the unease. The house was supposed to be a place to rest, a quiet place for grieving, but it ended up feeling like a trap. The photos, the silence, the strange call from the host who never explained anything. It all felt too strange. When I got home, I tried to find a listing online again, but the house had been removed. The website said it was no longer available, no reviews, no pictures. It was like it never existed on the site. I called the police and explained everything. The photos, the strange call, the picture on the nightstand. They told me they would check it out, but when they went to the address, the house was empty and abandoned. No furniture, no signs of recent visitors, just an empty shell. It was the strangest experience I've ever had. I still don't know who lived there or why the photos looked like my family, but left me out. The only thing I'm sure of is that I was never supposed to be there. That house was a stranger's, but someone wanted me to feel like it was mine, or maybe remind me that I didn't belong. I'm still shaken when I think about it, especially when I look at old family photos now. I check them carefully, making sure I'm there, making sure I belong where I think I do. Because for one night, in that quiet suburban house, I wasn't sure anymore.